Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku faced Bakugou's fist part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗧𝗵𝗲 So let's start the video. A happy beginning chapter text. The incident from last week was still fresh in everyone's mind. It had all the students of Class 1 teeming with tension, but no one had decided to address it. Rather, they allowed it to linger and left words unsaid. The tension was so thick that it seemed to take shape and hang in the air like a thick fog, looming over conversations, so they were stopped short and eventually everyone had somewhat started to avoid each other, too exhausted to deal with the mist that would take dominion over their conversations that once seemed to be able to go on for a lifetime. Kirishima, for one, hated it. It had just been a few weeks since they had moved into the dorms, and he remembered feeling ecstatic to be able to bond with everyone. He could barely keep the smile off his face when he was inside the dorms, which seemed to piss off Bakugou, who told him to fuck off and stop being so damn happy. Kirishima responded with a laugh and only smiled wider, to which Bakugou responded by flipping him off. Kirishima couldn't help but chuckle fondly at the memory, something he thought he'd be making much more of, what with how much time he'd be spending with his classmates. At the thought, Kirishima couldn't help but sigh, his smile dropping off his face when he remembered just how tense everything had been with everyone lately. And here he was standing in front of the door of the person who caused all the animosity. Kirishima lifted his arm, forming his hand into a fist as he mentally prepared himself for what was to come. He let out a determined huff, brought his hand down to connect with wood, then stopped and thought better of his actions. He repeated this many times before sighing and realizing that he wasn't getting anywhere. Maybe if he rather took an inhale of breath to prepare himself, he would be more ready. Kirishima convinced himself that that would be a better approach, and so he puffed up his chest and couldn't help but giggle slightly, imagining that he was a valiant knight and what he was about to face was a vile beast with blasts so strong that they would leave him as nothing more than ashes. Kirishima frowned at that. Maybe this wasn't a good idea. Suddenly the door he had been facing swung open and Kirishima let out a loud shriek, falling on his ass and glancing up at searing red eyes glaring down at him. Kirishima couldn't help but gulp as he took in the blonde's appearance, and Bakugou did not look happy. "Are you gonna fucking knock or are you gonna stay out here?" Bakugou gestured towards all of Kirishima, drawing a circle with his hand and wearing a disgusted expression on his face. "Playing with yourself?" Kirishima blushed in embarrassment, realizing that his friend had likely known he was there the entire time, and even though it was likely impossible, Kirishima couldn't fight the feeling that Bakugou witnessed him make an absolute fool of himself outside the room. Letting out a nervous laugh, Kirishima stood up quickly, feeling too much like prey under the blonde's angry glare. He rubbed the back of his neck again and laughed in an awkward manner when the boy cocked an eyebrow at him expectantly as if to say, "What the fuck do you want?" And knowing Bakugou, that was probably exactly what he meant. And then some. Kirishima shifted from side to side, uncomfortably trying to decide how to structure his words so he wouldn't anger his temperamental classmate who already seemed ready to blow his face up. And to be honest, he was drawing up a blank. The bitterness that seemed to form between everyone had also affected Bakugou and Kirishima's relationship, and Kirishima couldn't help but feel frustrated that this felt like the first time in a while that he was talking to his friend, even more so that he didn't know what to say. Apparently Kirishima had taken too long to answer, and Bakugou had already moved to slam the door in the redhead's face, so Kirishima quickly shouted out what he had come there for in the first place. "I came to ask you to hang out with us." Kirishima let out a sigh of relief when the door stopped, frozen in its place, before it swung back open and ash-blonde hair peeked out again in its absence. "Us?" Bakugou asked incredulously. Kirishima couldn't help but grimace, but it was to be expected with how observant the blonde was. Even then, it didn't take a detective to realize how sour relationships had become in Class 1, and so Kirishima didn't blame Bakugou for finding the implication that anyone was hanging out, and inviting him no less, the cause of the problem, suspicious. Kirishima brushed the thought away, not wanting to blame his friend for his actions because he knew that at this moment, mending the class morale was more important. Confronting Bakugou could come later. So Kirishima offered a smile and nodded, before backtracking slightly. "Well, I hope it's us, Kaminari, and I came up with the idea to watch movies in the common room so everyone can bond again. So he's going door to door to invite everyone, and I decided to come get you." Kirishima spoke cheerfully, making sure he maintained his bright smile that Bakugou always squinted at, mumbling something like "fucking sun in my eyes." He decided to omit the fact that Kaminari mentioned that the only way to get Bakugou to join was to literally drag him down, screaming and kicking. Kirishima hoped it wouldn't come to that, but he couldn't be too sure with how the blonde was regarding him skeptically. Though skeptically was better than angrily, or murderously, or explodingly. Kirishima couldn't help but laugh to himself at the last one. earning a strange look from Bakugou, so he immediately pursed his lips and cursed his mind that seemed unable to focus. Seeming too tired to ask about what the fuck was wrong with him, Bakugou just glanced down at the floor and stayed silent. Kirishima tensed, immediately noticing the change in mood and wanting to comfort his friend, whose proud shoulders seemed to slouch and scarlet orbs seemed unable to meet his own. I don't think that's a good idea. Kirishima blinked dumbly at him, the hint of something in Bakugou's voice, sounding too close to sadness for the redhead's liking, clouding his thoughts and causing him to forget what they had been talking about. Realizing this, Bakugou groaned in annoyance but still refused to look up at the boy. I shouldn't come. Bakugou spoke in a distant voice and seemed angry with this, so he snapped his head up to Kirishima and hissed, "You guys go have fun." Kirishima's heart ached at this. Bakugou knew that it was his fault that everyone was so angry, and in a way of punishing himself, he wants to allow the class to make amends, ostracizing himself in the process. Well, that wasn't going to happen. Not on Kirishima's watch. He knew the soft route wouldn't work, so decided to be a bit harsher. Yeah, maybe things would be better if you didn't join. Kirishima started and couldn't help but wonder if he made the right decision with how the blonde flinched at his words. Still, he continued, but I don't give a fuck about that. You're my best friend. Kirishima ignored the way Bakugou's nose scrunched up at the word best friend, and you fucked up. True, but I'm not gonna let you wallow away in self-pity. Own up to your mistake and come outside, because right now you're acting like a fucking coward. You're Bakugou Katsuki, and I know that if you're as manly as I think you are, you're gonna come down with me and face your classmate. Like a real hero would. Bakugou blinked at Kirishima, mouth opening, then deciding against his words and closing, then opening again. Kirishima couldn't help but liken the image to that of a fish and laughed, in his head this time. But it seemed Bakugou heard even this, because his eyes snapped upwards, wild with a fierce glare. Kirishima squeaked. Bakugou was obviously thrown off on what he was about to say, as his newfound determination dissipated into an annoyed glare. He looked at Kirishima and this time asked, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Kirishima smiled widely at this. "Oh, sorry. I probably cut off whatever manly statement you were about to make, but we don't have time for that. I'm assuming you've agreed, and so I'm taking you there." Kirishima didn't give Bakugou time to process his words before he was dragging the blonde out of his room, and Bakugou let out a string of curses at the boy's persistence and energy. Kirishima thought, I guess I am dragging him down, kicking and screaming. As they got closer to their destination, Kirishima slowed down and Bakugou openly expressed his relief of this. Even though the boy was trying to hide it, it was obvious that Bakugou was nervous about facing his classmates. Kirishima knew the boy had seen them in class, but the setting had allowed him to ignore them completely. The situation now was Kirishima practically forcing him to hang out with a group of people that might hate his guts, and the redhead found himself feeling guilty. He slowed down further before coming to a complete stop in front of Bakugou. Kirishima could feel the blonde eyeing him, observing him for his next move. Kirishima turned to Bakugou and sighed, the smile which he had tried so hard to keep plastered on his face finally peeling off. "Look, dude, if you don't want to do this, that's fine. I don't want to force you into anything." Kirishima's words were cut off with a snort. "You already spouted a bunch of shit about how it wouldn't be manly of me to, and I quote, own up to my mistake and come outside, because right now I'm acting like a fucking coward. Bit late to backtrack from that one, shitty hair." Bakugou rolled his eyes, a hint of amusement dancing on his taunch. Kirishima found himself rubbing the back of his neck once again, embarrassment clear on his features. "Yeah, sorry." Once again, Bakugou let out a snort. "Don't know why you're apologizing. It's the fucking truth and I needed to hear it." Kirishima brightened, a real smile finally tugging on his lips as he recalled Bakugou calling him shitty hair, a term he had initially treated with offense but was forced to get used to, as he now felt it represented his friendship with Bakugou. "Alright, fucker, lead the way," Bakugou huffed. Kirishima felt his smile falter a bit at the rude awakening at what they had to face just beyond the door that suddenly seemed a lot closer than it was a few minutes ago. Kirishima nodded and steeled himself. If he was expecting Bakugou to stand in front of the class, exposed to be judged in front of scrutinizing eyes, the least he could do was be prepared was to do the same. It would be unmanly not to. And so, without a second thought, Kirishima nodded to himself and steeled himself. Because if he was expecting Bakugou to stand in front of the class, the least he could do was be exposed to swell. Bakugou scoffed at Kirishima's obvious hesitance, so that the boy flushed at the exposure, feeling more embarrassed with how he repeated the words in his head to buy himself more time. "Stand behind me then." Bakugou grunted and made large steps, so he was heading towards the door. Kirishima's eyes widened and quickly ran forward to walk in front of the boy and spoke in a similar gruff voice. "You stand behind me." Kirishima heard the boy scoff behind him, and he was surprised to see Bakugou run forward to get in front of Kirishima, an evident smirk splayed on his face as he marched ahead. Kirishima quickly stuck his foot out, so the blonde fell with a yelp and looked down at the splayed body and nodded, trying to keep a serious look on when all he wanted to do was burst out laughing. Immediately, he made his descent towards the door. He heard shuffling behind him and gasped, hurrying into a sprint, guessing that Bakugou was going to try and blast ahead of him at any moment. Kirishima felt his eyes gleam in amusement. He had missed this, just acting stupid with his friends, and the fact that it was a rare occurrence with Bakugou made him feel that much happier. Kirishima heard an explosion go off behind him and was apparently too excited to think that stepping in front of a projectile that was hurling towards him just so he could win the ridiculous race they had created was stupid and would hurt. Bakugou, obviously realizing how much this would hurt before Kirishima did, made a sound of panic, and Kirishima couldn't help but imagine the boy flailing to stop himself. Deciding that seeing that was more interesting than winning the makeshift race, Kirishima turned around. His eyes widened and, ironically, he turned into the one with his arms flailing, finally understanding his mistake, and how much this would hurt. But it was too late to move, and Kirishima tried turning so his back would face the brunt of the pain. This ended with Bakugou slamming into Kirishima's side as the two boys launched down the corridor in a frenzy of pain, shouts, and curses. They braced themselves to be stopped by the sturdiness of a door, but it seemed that the loud noises had alerted those in the common room, and it has been opened by none other than Ishido. She shrieked when she saw the heap approach her and jumped out of the way. Kirishima felt like his head was exploding, and the weight of the boy who was about to launch him into freaking orbit wasn't helping. So, without hesitation, Kirishima kicked Bakugou away and was shocked to see him shout "fuck" as he was launched into the wall on the other side of the room from the momentum. Though, Kirishima didn't have time to worry about him because he managed to slam his head into the marble island that stood in the room, accidentally activating his quirk and causing the material to crack. The room was silent until Kirishima groaned and Bakugou wheezed from his position on, more like in, the wall, and completely unaware of the classmates that were eyeing them with confusion and concern. Kirishima felt a loud laugh rip out of his chest, and Bakugou followed his lead shortly after. Everything hurt, and somehow that made the redhead laugh louder. He was clutching at his stomach, unable to stop, and damn, he couldn't breathe. But it felt great. All this tension had been building up so high inside him, and Kirishima couldn't help but dread when it would come crashing down. And now it was, but not how he thought it would. Because right now he was on the floor, cackling and wheezing and hearing reciprocating sounds from Bakugou. Even though Bakugou was doomed to face his classmates in what was likely to be an awkward evening that would either make or break friendships, he couldn't help but feel that the night couldn't have started in a better way. A successful mission chapter text. Ishido hadn't been that surprised when she found Kaminari knocking at her door. Nor was she surprised when he told her about his and Kirishima's plan to rekindle the class with Bakugou. She made sure to voice her doubts that anyone would even come, but, honestly, she hoped they would. She still wasn't sure how she felt towards the explosive blonde. His words still weighed heavy on her mind. It annoyed her to no end because she considered him her friend, but each time she made a move to talk to him, she found her body recoiling, as if reacting in anger before her brain could catch up. And when it hit her, when she remembered what he said, Mina let out a shaky breath, letting herself sink deeper into the couch of the common room. The raven-haired girl next to her immediately responded to this and squeezed her closed fist so she'd look up at her. When Mina's eyes met hers, she couldn't help but feel guilty at the concerned expression that wore down the girl's features. It was obvious that Mina wasn't the only one who was affected by the blonde's words, but she had cooped herself up in her room, acting like she was, what with how she was the closest female friend to Bakugou. But now, looking into the tired eyes of her friend, she felt guilty that she hadn't spoken to anyone and let what happened affect her friendships. Mina knew it was small, but she wanted to make up for it and moved so she could squeeze the hand of the girl's before sending back a bright smile. Thanks, 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐵. The girl sent back her own smile, and it made Mina feel warm. Why had she separated herself from her friends in the first place? What did surprise Mina was that the entire class was sitting down in the common room and rebonding over snacks as they watched a movie that blared from the large TV. She expected a few faces but found herself at a loss for words when she spotted all 18 students bustling around the common room. This made the warmth in Mina's chest spread. They had probably all been tired of how tense it had been. At first the general emotion was disbelief, then anger, but now it had just become exhausting. Mina was glad that everyone had decided to talk to each other again, but she found herself frowning thinking about how they'd react when Bakugou came. She didn't even know how she'd react. Suddenly, Ishido felt herself bound up in a hug and squeaked in surprise. It was Uraraka, who had seemingly dragged along 𝗧𝗪 and Hagakure so they could squish both Mina and Momo in a tight embrace. Mina let out a wet laugh and hugged them back as much as her arms allowed, before dropping them down and gazing upon her friends' faces with a teary expression. Seeing Ishido on the verge of tears, the girls gasped and once again held each other in a tight hug. Mina sniffled and wriggled out of the grip with a giggle. When she looked back up at her friends, who she had isolated herself from, she saw they wore similar sad expressions. Mina opened her mouth, wanting to break the silence, but something else did it for her. The sound of thudding footsteps, accompanied by shouts and curses. The warm atmosphere halted and Mina felt herself hold her breath as some others around the room tensed for what was to come. With a determination that Ishido didn't understand or know, she walked forward to open the door, wanting to be the first to face Bakugou. But when the acid quirk user opened it, what she saw had her shrieking and jumping out of the way. The tense mood that had built up in the room morphed into that of confusion at the pink girl's reaction. And then a blur that looked a lot like Bakugou slammed into the wall across the room, letting out a loud fuck. Following shortly after was Kirishima, whose head managed to crack the island that stood tall in the room as a centerpiece. The room was silent. Mina could only gape. She was expecting a quiet and awkward entrance from Bakugou as an introduction to the evening which would likely last the entire night. But she hadn't expected this. And suddenly, the room was filled with laughter. Wheezing and breathtaking laughter that she remembered having with the friendship group she liked to call the Baka Squad. But that group wasn't really complete without Bakugou, and hanging out just served as a reminder of his absence. So they stopped trying. Looking at the blonde boy now, she realized she had never really seen him laugh, and the thought made her frown. She remembered making a loud deceleration to Bakugou, saying she would be the one to make him laugh, to which he responded with an eye roll. Good luck with that. Raccoon eyes. Mina frowned at the sight, because right now Bakugou was laughing so hard that he couldn't stop himself, clutching at his stomach and trying to cover his mouth to prevent the burst of chuckles, and she couldn't go over and laugh with him. Bakugou gasped, and Mina wasn't sure if it was from his laughing fit or from pain. Oh, fuck. Okay, 1, fuck you, and 2, I won. Kirishima jumped up from the floor, then winced, and decided to lean against the object that was now decorated with cracks along its side. What? No, I obviously crossed the finish first. Bakugou also stood up from the floor, using the wall that now had a dent as support. Even if you did, you kicked me. That's a fucking foul. And by the way, what the fuck? Bakugou fumed, letting a few sparks go off, finally recovering from the shock of whatever that was. Mina spoke before Kirishima could form a retort. Actually, the two boys jolted in surprise, obviously unaware that they were in a room full of people. Bakugou did come first. The pink girl cringed at how her voice sounded slightly awkward when she was actually hoping to make a joke. Snapping out of his shock first, Bakugou turned to Kirishima and flipped him off with a smirk. Sucks to suck, and Kirishima pouted in defeat. All the playfulness that was on the blonde's face a second ago was wiped off as he turned to face his classmates and stuffed his hands into his pockets. His eyes scanned over each of their faces, over Mina's face, and he seemed to frown further, obviously wanting to burn all evidence of him laughing just seconds before. Mina frowned that Bakugou thought of her as someone he had to shield himself from. But it was to be expected. Kirishima had at least been making attempts to talk to the blonde boy while Mina had ignored his very existence. She couldn't help but regret it now. Mina wanted to catch the boy's eyes so she could convey her feelings of remorse, but Bakugou only grunted slightly, mumbling something under his breath as he shifted from foot to foot and his gaze met the floor. Before the awkward cloud that was seeming to form could settle in the air, Kaminari sprung up and spoke in a cheerful voice. Hey dude, I thought you guys weren't coming. I saved seats for you. Bakugou glared at the area that Kaminari was waving for them to come over to. He probably wanted to sit as far away from the class as possible, Mina thought. Kaminari chuckled awkwardly when Bakugou didn't move from his spot and continued to glare. That's when Mina decided to take initiative and make sure the plan that her friends tried so hard to set up didn't fail. She wore a large smile and stuck her hands on her hips. Come on, Blasty. You planning on keeping us waiting? Mina spoke proudly, but she honestly didn't know how he would react, and that forced an undertone of strain in her voice that she hoped no one had heard. His eyes immediately snapped towards her. He was regarding her suspiciously, and Mina held her breath but maintained her carefree stance. Bakugou lifted an accusing finger towards the television. You guys aren't waiting for shit. The movie's playing. He spoke with a sneering tone. Mina couldn't fight the giggle that left her lips at Bakugou, who always managed to speak snarkily. It's fine. We can still watch. Kirishima chuckled and had moved so he could push Bakugou forward, leading him to the space on the couch near Kaminari and 𝗧𝗧. Bakugou didn't provide much resistance but still cursed like a sailor at the redhead. When he had finally seated, Kirishima wedged in beside him. Mina realized that she had been standing in the same spot watching the entire interaction. 𝗧𝗧 turned and beckoned her with a wave of his hand, and the acid quirk user shuffled forward slightly, making as much noise as she could and hoping that Bakugou was fine with her sitting near him. When he didn't make any action in protest, she ran forward and sat on the floor in front of him and leaned back onto his legs. Bakugou huffed loudly and Kirishima laughed, but otherwise none of them said anything. Ishido turned her head to see Uraraka frowning at her new position. The girl responded with a sheepish smile and mouthed sorry. It had become an unspoken rule for the girls to ignore Bakugou and stay angry at him. But Ishido couldn't bear it anymore. Yes, his words were harsh and horrible, but from the way everyone was acting, it seemed that situation would never be fixed, and that bothered Ishido more than anything. It was a sensitive topic, and it wasn't like Mina was letting Bakugou off the hook because when this had all died down, she was planning to talk to him about it. But it had been too much for the pink girl, and she just wanted to be able to spend time with her friend again. Mina faced the TV when she saw Uraraka's frown deepen. 𝐒𝐴𝐵 had been the one most outraged by Bakugou, considering the whole situation started with their argument. But the girl had been really bitter this past week, and even though they were friends, Ashido found herself wanting to run away whenever an insult against Bakugou fell past her classmates' lips. It had never been anything too bad, just snide comments that were randomly dropped in, catching everyone off guard, and yet Mina's stomach had twisted at her own silence, frustrated at her inability to defend her friend. One time it got so bad that Mina didn't say anything. She just stood up and left, unable to hear any more. From then on, she started avoiding everyone. But that doesn't matter now, Mina thought as she laughed at a comment a character made. Things won't be so bad now. A stolen confession chapter text. Midoriya smiled happily at his childhood friend and offered a quiet "Hey Kaken." It'd be a lie to say he was surprised at how the boy scoffed and ignored him. In any other circumstance, he might have gotten a "fuck off, Deku," accompanied by a pointed glare, but Izuku knew that wasn't the case. Tonight had been planned to settle the bad blood between everyone, and Kaken was the guest of honor. He was smart enough to know that his words could antagonize the entire class against him, and decided that silence was better because the whole evening would probably be ruined if he said whatever he wanted to Midori. The thought made Izuku smile, proud at how Kaken was attempting to form real relationships with the class. Making sure to audibly express her annoyance with the blonde's actions, Izuku heard 𝐒𝐴𝐵 scoff beside him. "Just ignore him, Deku," she grumbled. Midoriya offered her a tight-lipped smile, fighting the urge to reprimand her for her sour mood when everyone was here to fix things. Not really wanting to deal with her, Izuku turned to face Todoroki and raised up his bag of crisps. "Do you want some?" The dual quirk user eyed the bag curiously, before reaching his hand into the packet and taking out a single crisp. Midoriya couldn't fight his small chuckle. "You can take more, you know." The boy nodded his head and reached his hand into the bag, voicing his thanks as he, once again, took out only one crisp. Midoriya laughed at his friend and took out a heap of crisps from the packet. "You can take as much as you want." Todoroki smiled curiously, probably confused on what was so funny. He nodded once again and took a larger portion of crisps, and leaned back to focus on the movie playing. As if on cue, Ada stood and spoke in a booming voice. "Everyone, make sure not to eat too much junk food. We should be aiming to maintain a healthy diet as aspiring heroes." "No way, I'm here to pig out," Kaminari shouted back with a smile, earning him an annoyed groan from Bakugou. "Don't fucking shout in my ears, dunce face." Ada made a noise of disapproval. "Language, Bakugou." His hand gestures, emphasizing his displeasure. "I can say whatever the fuck I want," Bakugou retorted, earning some laughs around the room. Izuku was suddenly aware of 𝐒𝐴𝐵, who was beside him, shaking in rage. It almost felt like he was watching in slow motion as his friend stood up, trembling in anger as she ultimately ruined the night. "That's the thing. You can't just say whatever the fuck you want," she practically screamed, venom and hate thick in her voice, allowing it to coat over and drip from her words. That drop caused a ripple effect, and the carefree atmosphere died, choking and gagging on the poison that seeped in from her voice. Everyone tensed and went silent, and though Izuku couldn't speak for everyone, he knew that he was slightly annoyed at the girl for laying waste over what was supposed to be a joyful night. Bakugou blinked in surprise but said nothing. He pursed his lips and turned to face the television, focusing solely on the movie. Midoriya felt relieved that the situation hadn't escalated and turned into a shouting match between the two. The freckled boy hoped that was the end of it and tugged 𝐒𝐴𝐵 so that she would sit down. But she shook his hand away, and it seemed like she wanted to shout again. Midoriya saw Jiru grimace and also stand. 𝐒𝐴𝐵, chill. The offending girl looked like she wanted to say something but thought against it. A deep blush sprouted from her cheeks as she saw everyone looking at her. Izuku felt he could finally relax when he saw her drop back down onto the couch, crossing her arms with a pout playing on her lips. Thankfully, everyone decided to ignore the outburst and focused on watching the movie. Izuku felt like a couple years had been cut off his life from the stress of it all. He was glad that the night wasn't going to end in a complete disaster, but if Uraraka's emotional outburst was anything to go off of, it was obvious that a calming talk was in order. But maybe not tonight, he thought bitterly. I don't think anything calming can come after that. The night went on without any more interruptions. Rather, it was filled laughs at comedic scenes, or coos and at romantic scenes, and sobs at sad ones. If you asked Izuku, he would say he didn't cry, but how couldn't he? Even now he found himself sniffling, remembering the scene where the dog died. Of course, he was faced with an onslaught of insults from Kaken, who exposed the tears that were dripping down his face to the entire class. They had already gone through 4 movies and were just stating their 5th. Izuku let out a yawn as his eyes struggled to focus. His lazy green orbs scanned around the room and he saw the blurry image of tired classmates. Kirishima sat down after putting on the movie. I think this is gonna be the last one, guys. The movie starred a strong female protagonist that had all the girls' eyes gleaming as they directed their attention towards the screen. Stubborn girls like that aren't attractive. Us guys need to have a little control over them. Izuku grimaced at Mina's comment. He understood why the short boy was here since this was something for the entire class. But when he saw the grape-headed boy, he couldn't help but dread when the boy would say something that angered somebody. Hagakure scoffed. It's not like you're getting any girls in the first place. Beggars can't be choosers. Midoriya had to stifle a laugh at that, not wanting to embarrass his classmate any more than that comment definitely had. However, 𝗧𝗏 had no qualms about this and let out a roaring laugh. Yeah, dude, and your type is seriously old-fashioned. The black-haired boy nudged Kaminari beside him so he could say his own view. Kaminari shrugged. I mean, as long as they're hot. I'm all down. 𝗧𝗏 cackled at his friend's words. All down for what? That just makes you sound like a man-whore. Kaminari looked offended at the description. Hey, no it doesn't. Anyone would think the same. Kaminari turned to the other boys for support. Izuku felt his cheeks heat at the embarrassing topic and turned away when Kaminari's desperate eyes met his. Apparently Kaminari found a different victim to support him, because he jumped up and stood in front of a certain grumbling blonde. Right, Bakugou. Don't you agree that no one can resist a pretty face? Midoriya's face went pale and he felt his blood run cold as he saw Kaken stiffen at the word pretty. I don't give a fuck. Bakugou grunted, trying to conceal his blatant switch in mood, revealing how uncomfortable he was with the topic, much more now that attention was placed upon him regarding said topic. Kaminari, ever the teaser, immediately caught on to this and a large smile graced his face. What? Is Kaken embarrassed? Are you inexperienced? Don't worry, dude, I'm pretty sure everyone is. The energetic blonde spoke in a cooing voice, ending his words with a mocking tone of understanding. Midoriya felt like he was going to be sick. He could only imagine what Kaken felt like. Kirishima chuckled and turned away, likely thinking that Kaminari was digging his own grave by mocking his explosive classmate like that. Midoriya watched with a horror-filled gaze as everyone disregarded the situation as Kaminari just being his fun and energized self. Izuku shook his head, causing his large green curls to fall into his eyes. He pushed them away in annoyance and tried to turn his large eyes to see Kaken's expression, to see if he was okay with this. And he wasn't. He wasn't because Izuku could see how he held his breath, how his jaw was locked, how his blood-red eyes glared up at the standing blonde. It was easy to write off his look as angry, but Izuku knew Kaken. He knew him, and swimming within those scarlet orbs was a signal of danger. They were observing Kaminari as if he was something different than what he was. In that moment, Kaken's eyes were clouded as the differing images of friend or enemy clashed with each other. Midoriya couldn't even begin to fathom exactly what Kaken was imagining, but he knew that the boy was tense like a cornered animal and Kaminari's next move would be the deciding factor on his next action. Kaminari leaned forward, enclosing Bakugou on the couch in what he believed to be in a joking manner. If you want to gain some experience. He waggled his eyebrows down at the boy whose body had gone completely stiff. Midoriya was sure that Kaken's mind had come to a conclusion as his uncertain eyes drowned in panic, and he stood suddenly, body stiff in terror. And as they all expected, Bakugou's hand immediately raised to the face of the teasing blonde. What they hadn't expected was that, rather than explosions mixed with a string of curses and insults, Bakugou's fist connected with the boy's face and Kaminari was left howling on the floor, gripping his bleeding nose. Yaoyorozu was the first to react. She shot up and ran to Kaminari's side. Bakugou, what are you doing? Midoriya stood and reached out for Kaken as a choked sob broke past the blonde boy's lips. His hands were slapped away, and Midoriya regarded Kaken with wide eyes full of concern. The explosive boy was breathing heavy, eyes glazed over with oncoming tears. Midoriya felt himself shrink back when Bakugou's eyes moved haphazardly around the room, not focusing on one thing, and frantic as if danger was everywhere and suffocating him. It was something Izuku could only describe as pure and unadulterated terror. Kaken stumbled back in fear before spinning around and sprinting back up to his room. Izuku's blood that had seemed to ice over, frozen in his body, suddenly thawed and started pumping at an alarming rate. He could barely register the voices of his classmates over the reverberate of his heartbeat. As blood was boiling, Izuku whipped around to face the boy who had terrified his childhood friend. Why would you say something like that to Kaken? He growled. The blonde boy in question had his hands over his face and looked up to meet Izuku's rageful gaze, letting out a muffled huh. Izuku fumed and had to clench his fists to control the sparks of green that had started lighting up around his body. You're his friend. How could you do that? Ida let out an exasperated sigh. Midoriya, calm down. While it's true that Kaminari's words were a bit inappropriate, Bakugou's reaction was completely uncalled for, not to mention an overreaction. An overreaction? Midoriya was trembling with so much rage, he didn't know what to do with himself. It's Kaminari's own fault he got hurt. Everyone looked at Midoriya in surprise, shocked by his blatant rage, an uncommon thing for the green-haired boy. The injured boy made an offended whine from the floor. Izuku's eyes snapped to him and sent a glare so searing that the boy averted his eyes. I think it's obvious that we don't really understand the situation, but for now, I think you should calm down, Midoriya. Todoroki spoke calmly. Midoriya squeezed his eyes shut and took a deep inhale of air, trying to calm himself down. It was working a bit. I shouldn't be angry. They don't know I don't understand why you're defending him. Midoriya's eyes snapped open and he felt his rage flare up again when he saw that the snarky comment came from Uraraka. Kirishima cleared his throat awkwardly from where he was inspecting his bleeding friend. Maybe now's not a good time to get annoyed. Why not? Ochako sneered and Midoriya had to bite down his tongue so he didn't say something he would regret. Everyone seems perfectly fine with letting Bakugou do whatever the hell he wants. What with what he did last week and now this Uraraka? Midoriya warned. His head was pulsing and he really didn't want to hear her voice anymore. Ochako didn't take the warning. Rather, she decided to continue. No, I'm done turning a blind eye at how he treats everyone. And he treats you worst of all. Izuku flinched, but Ochako still didn't stop. He doesn't even see you as a friend. He doesn't see you as an equal. Anyone who thinks of themselves as Bakugou's friend is kidding themselves. Midoriya saw Kirishima clench his jaw, Ashido tense and Siro narrow his eyes. Kaminari spoke up, voice muffled behind the mass of his hands. It doesn't hurt that bad and I'm sure he didn't really mean it. Uraraka scoffed loudly. Like I said, you're all in denial. After everything, can't you see what type of person he is? Izuku breathing was out of control. What kind of person is he, then? He spat, daring her to voice her thoughts. He's a horrible person, a bully, a villain. Midoriya felt his body move on its own and before he knew it, his hand had punched through the wall. Shut the fuck up. You don't know anything about Kaken, so shut up. Ochako chose to ignore how Midoriya's rage was bordering hysteria. I know that he would never defend you the way you do him. Rather than breathing, Midoriya was just gasping for air and hot tears poured down his face, scalding, just like his fury. Because I don't deserve it. I don't deserve anything but hate from Kaken. Midoriya's voice was hoarse and yet he kept screaming. Midoriya was sure that he saw people moving to stop the argument, probably realizing that it was delving into something too personal. And it was. Midoriya knew he should just keep his mouth closed. This wasn't something he had the right to tell. But right now his mind was screaming at him that they were insulting Kaken, defaming him, and his gut twisted the more he allowed it to happen. I said it and I'll say it again. Shut up. Haze. Shut up, a shut up villain. Shut up. The words were leaving Izuku's mouth before he could stop them. It did shut her up. In fact, it shut everyone up. And Midoriya was left gasping with wide teary eyes. His hands were clasped firmly over his mouth as if to try to force the words back down his throat so he could choke on them. He broke out into a cold sweat and his body trembled. No longer in anger but with overwhelming regret, because the words seemed to echo around the room in vibrations, beating on Izuku's body so it felt beaten and bruised. Aye. His voice quivered in the silence. It was too late. He already said it, screaming a confession in anger that didn't belong to him. He wanted to shrivel up and die because he had just stolen something that he could never give back. Surely the words were ringing in everyone else's mind the same way it was for Izuku. Kaken was raped as a child. Kaken had always been pretty ever since he was young. Adults had always told him this, and since Kaken was in Izuku's earliest memories, grown-ups fawning over his friend was something he regarded as normal. But Midoriya is pretty sure that from the moment Kaken could properly form words and get his view across, he made it obvious that he had a distaste for the description. His nose would scrunch up and he'd make an unapproving noise, taking offense to the compliment. Eventually, Kaken had started forming his eyes into slits, glaring at every living thing and pulling his lips into a frightening snarl. Also that the word pretty would wither and die on people's tongues before they could even dare think of speaking it into existence. But Kaken had always been like that, always seeing the bad side of good things said to him, accusing people of trying to put him down and be better than him. Basically, he wasn't very trusting. Which is why Izuku, a nerdy and emotional child, was so confused with how he formed a friendship with the loud and confident boy. But Kaken had never seemed annoyed with his presence, and Midoriya prided himself on the close friendship they shared. In the small boy's green eyes, he couldn't see a single fault in his childhood friend, and so he had always chased after Kaken, going through every single adventure, every single trial. All because Midoriya couldn't help but admire the boy that seemed so many miles ahead of him no matter how close he was. Always out of reach. Midoriya would sometimes cry or get too scared while joining in on Kaken's escapades, to which Kaken's friends responded by taunting him, making him cry harder. The blonde boy would always shout at them saying it's Deku. Of course, he's gonna cry. He just needs a bit of encouragement, which was as much comfort as one could get from the blonde boy. But Izuku always felt his chest swell with pride when Kaken would offer him a hand and hold his the entire time. getting looks of jealousy from the surrounding boys. He would puff up his chest and laugh happily, tears long forgotten. It was obvious that he was 𝐻𝐭𝐸's closest friend, which is why Midoriya knew he shouldn't disappoint him. When the boy came knocking at the door, asking for Izuku, the emotional boy couldn't help but be surprised to see only 𝐻𝐿 outside and no one else. "Hey 𝐻𝐿, where's everyone else?" Izuku tilted his head in curiosity, but 𝐻𝐿 didn't answer and just pulled him outside, so Izuku stumbled forward with a yelp. The blonde boy spun around and walked in front of Izuku, shouting his goodbyes to the house. "Izu-chan and I are leaving, Auntie." He got an exasperated laugh from inside the house in reply. Izuku finally remembered how to use his legs and ran after the retreating form of 𝐻𝐿's back. "Where are we going, 𝐻𝐿? And where's everyone else?" The fast-walking boy stopped suddenly, so Midoriya had to skid to a halt. 𝐻𝐿 turned to face him and wore a wicked smile on his face. But then he immediately changed his demeanor and appeared serious, seemingly about to say something very important. Midoriya held his breath in anticipation. 𝐻𝐿 talked in a hushed whisper, eyes scanning the surrounding area as if someone was listening in on their conversation. "We're going on a secret mission. We were the only 2 heroes dispatched to deal with the villain." The boy's green eyes blinked dumbly in confusion before he understood that 𝐻𝐿 was only pretending. Izuku laughed loudly, feeling silly that he fell for 𝐻𝐿's act so easily. "Oh, okay," he cheered. "SHH. 𝐻𝐿 hushed but couldn't fight his giggle. Izuku also giggled but made sure to be quiet as he nodded, attempting his words again. "Oh, okay." This time it was in a hushed voice. 𝐻𝐿 nodded at him, his expression turning serious again, and Midoriya attempted to copy it, struggling hard to fight the twitch of his lips. "My hero name is Lord Murder. Nice to meet you." 𝐻𝐿 trailed off expectantly, asking for Midoriya's hero name in turn. Izuku giggled at how well 𝐻𝐿's name suited him even if he didn't have his quirk yet. When he thought of his own, he came up blank and shrugged at 𝐻𝐿, sending the boy a sheepish smile. "All right, it can be Hero Deku," 𝐻𝐿 decided, and Midoriya smiled at the familiar name. "Come on, Deku. We've already wasted too much time and the villain has been running free." Midoriya, now Hero Deku, giggled and pointed forward. "Lead the way, Lord Murder." They had obviously forgotten the rule of quiet because now they were running. Lord Murder leading the way, letting out loud laughs as they ran along the pavement. They kept running, and Deku wondered when they were going to stop but didn't bother asking, because excitement was pumping through his veins and willing his body to move. It took Deku a second to register Lord Murder running into a dark alley, and he forced himself to stop. Realizing he wasn't following anymore, Lord Murder turned and frowned, before beckoning Deku to follow, but the hero stayed rooted in his position. Lord Murder marched over to Deku and crossed his arms in as if to say, "What's the problem?" 𝐻𝐿 Deku's words were cut off with a displeased grunt. "Lord Murder, I don't think it'd be good to go in there." The blonde's expression seemed to grow in annoyance. "Can we just play away from these types of places? My mom says they're dangerous." Lord Murder let out a groan. "We're heroes, Deku. We're going in there because it's dangerous." Deku wanted to protest, to say they weren't really heroes and that this was stupid, but he didn't want 𝐻𝐿 to get angry with him. He nodded hesitantly, so the large smile returned to the other boy's face. "Come on." They ran in, and it got darker with every step. Darkness surrounded them, its hungry jaws enclosing around them, blocking their route of escape. Rays of sunlight seemed to shy away from the mouth of the ravenous beast, refusing to follow the 2 boys on their treacherous quest no matter how much Izuku urged. He wished to turn and chase the rays that felt much safer than the cage of this dark prison, but he knew if he did that, he'd have to leave 𝐻𝐿, who'd be too stubborn to join him in his escape. And so he stayed undeterred on his path to keep up with the silhouette of his best friend's back. Izuku bit his cheek as he verbally recalled the memory. This was wrong. This was so wrong. After Ida got the boy to calm down from his incessant sobbing, Izuku's trembled, eyes finally meeting those of his shocked classmates. "Please forget what I said," he begged quietly. "It didn't. Jay, just please forget it." Anjiro had spoken up first, choosing his words carefully as he spoke in an uncertain tone. "Yeah, I think that's the best thing to do right now." But Ashido shook her head, eyes wide in disbelief. "No, what did you just say?" "What happened to 𝐵lasty?" she asked in a fearful voice. "You just said." Midoriya shrunk in on himself and looked at the ground, hating the sight of her tear-filled eyes and the trembling of her voice. But her words still found their way to his ears. "You can't just say that, and then how can you expect us to forget that?" she croaked. Midoriya shook his head, eyes still focused on the ground as he let out a broken sob. "Midoriya, can you please explain what you just said?" Kirishima spoke in a quiet voice. The boy in question squeezed his eyes shut and frantically shook his head, digging his fingernails into the palms of his hand. "Oh God." He let out another sob. I told them. Izuku's eyes snapped open as he felt the gentle touch of hands rest over his closed fist. Yaoyorozu stood in front of him and offered a gentle smile, squeezing his hands so he would relax them. Izuku, it's all right. Calm down." She spoke in a calming voice, lulling the boy like a mother would her child. Breathe. Okay. Izuku nodded quickly and took in deep breaths, drawing them out again in loud exhales. He could feel himself calming down, and the soothing rub on his shoulder from the raven-haired girl was helping him a great deal. I know you're panicking right now, but I think it would be beneficial for you to tell us what's bothering you. She spoke calmly. His breathing quickened once again. I can't. I can't. She rubbed his shoulders, and so his breathing pattern would return to a normal pace. No one here wants to force you to talk, okay? We're just worried about you, and I would recommend speaking your thoughts. Her voice was so reassuring that Izuku almost found himself agreeing. The past week had just been so stressful, and he had felt a burdensome weight on his shoulders. He knew letting everything out into the open would help him, but the feeling of betrayal was much heavier than anything else. Please don't judge him. The choked words came out as a sob. It's okay. No one is going to judge anybody, she soothed, but there was a pointed tone behind her words, as if daring anyone to say otherwise. And so, with the reassurance of Momo's coaxing words, Izuku was sitting on the couch surrounded by the rest of his classmates, retelling a story that didn't belong to him. Deku wasn't so sure he wanted to play heroes anymore, especially with how late it was getting. They had been playing around in the junctions of dark alleyways, fighting imaginary villains and winning. But now Deku thought they were trying their luck to stay any longer and expect not to run into a real villain. At that moment, it seemed like he had jinxed them, because Deku looked up to meet a pair of gray eyes that were gazing down at the two boys, who most likely called attention to themselves due to all the noise they had been making. All the color drained from his face, and his body froze in fear as he regarded the cement-colored pupils. When those eyes snapped towards his, he screamed loudly, alerting Kaken, who came bounding towards him to ask what was wrong. Immediately, Kaken saw the eyes as well, and his body went stiff. But rather than standing frozen like Izuku, the blonde pulled his friend behind him and snarled at the figure that hid in the shadows. The figure finally stepped forward and revealed himself. Izuku felt himself let out a sigh of relief, and Kaken's body relaxed. It wasn't a villain. It was just a man. You really scared Deku, Mr. Kaken spoke accusingly, always the confident one. The man tilted his head and just stared. My apologies. His voice was distant and desolate. Izuku observed the man and saw that he was rather plain looking. He giggled quietly to himself, feeling silly for mistaking the boring man as a villain. The man crouched so he was eye level with them, and Midoriya couldn't help but flinch when he looked at the man's eyes. Everything about the stranger was rather unremarkable. Everything except for his eyes. They were cold and barren and had the green-haired boy shivering when he held contact with them for too long. Those eyes shifted over to Kaken, and suddenly Midoriya didn't feel well. Because, yes, this didn't seem like a villain, but it was still a stranger. However, the boy was too afraid to voice his thoughts with the man right in front of them. What's your name? The man asked with half-lidded eyes. Midoriya was thankful that, even if it was just partly, he couldn't see the man's remote gray eyes. He was also thankful that the question wasn't directed at him, but it bothered him that meant it was directed at Kaken. My name's Katsuki. The boy pointed a thumb at his chest in a confident manner. Katsuki, the man repeated. Izuku felt himself tensing at how the name sounded so wrong coming from the man's mouth. His voice gave the name the same barren feel that his eyes held. For some reason this bothered Izuku, because he knew how much meaning Kaken put in his name. It was something he had always shouted out after every triumph, yelling that he was Katsuki Bakugou and that he should be remembered. It was how he claimed his victories, owned them. Kaken's name was something close-knitted with his personality, full of exploding fire and oozing confidence from its pores. But the man had just said it like it was nothing, tainting its powerful message with his dull persona. This must have bothered Kaken as well, because he narrowed his eyes slightly before mumbling yeah. Now it became silent, and the man was just staring at the blonde boy. Kaken shifted uncomfortably under the empty gaze, unable to discern the stranger's thoughts. Using the silence to his advantage, Izuku tapped his friend's arm so he would turn to face him. I think we should go back now, Kaken. It's getting dark. The boy could only hope his friend could see the desperate look in his emerald eyes. Thankfully Kaken did, and nodded. Yeah, goodbye, mister. The small blonde regarded the man but didn't feel the need to turn to look at him. Izuku was glad and also turned his back on those terrifying gray eyes. When Midoriya didn't hear footsteps behind him, he whipped around. Mister, I'm leaving, so you need to let go. Please. Hearing those words fall from his best friend's lips had Midoriya reeling in panic, understanding how serious the situation was if Kaken was scared enough to plead. And surely enough, the man had Kaken's wrist in his grasp. The boy let out a shout of pain, and Midoriya blanched in horror. The man's hands were turning white as he gripped the limb. You're very pretty, Katsuki, the man mumbled to himself as he gazed into the little boy's eyes. She was pretty too. Who? The trapped boy gasped, trying to reason with the man so he didn't hurt him further. Her, he droned as if that was answer enough. You're pretty like her. Her, that woman, you're like her. Midoriya charged forward and pulled on Kaken. He's not whoever you mean. He's a boy. Please let him go. We want to go back home. he reasoned frantically, his childlike mind too young to understand the ramblings of a madman. The man continued to gaze at Kaken. "I'll kill anyone who tries to take her away." The boys blanched, finally understanding the danger they were in. Izuku screamed and pulled harder when he heard the threat. He had to help Kaken. He had to save Kaken. The blonde boy was pale, spooked by the stranger who had a hold on him. He started kicking and throwing fists around in an effort to escape. It had worked because the man groaned and fell backwards, clutching his eye that was starting to bruise. Without a second thought, they dashed away. They didn't remember where they came from or where they were going, but their gnawing fear kept them sprinting down whichever path opened up to them. Midoriya saw Kaken gripping his hand as the boy dashed ahead, and even though he was scared, he couldn't have felt safer. Kaken is strong, so we're going to be okay. Izuku's heart stuttered when he saw dead gray eyes watching them from within the darkness, right ahead of them and blocking the path they were running down. And he wanted to scream, but his throat was clogged up in all his horror. But Kaken made a quick turn away from the man and into an opening, branching off into more paths. He stopped and scanned the area, and Midoriya trembled as his eyes swept around wildly, cowering at the thought of meeting bleak-lead pupils. Kaken was fast, and his movements had Izuku stumbling, but the trembling boy knew he preferred this because he did not want to let go of the blonde's hand. Before he knew what was happening, Midoriya was being shoved into a box that he noticed had been in the opening they ran into. He could tell that it was concealing enough and served well as a hiding place. Midoriya tugged on Kaken's hand, silently beckoning him to join, but the boy just shook his head. "There's not enough space," he whispered. "Stay here, I'll hide somewhere else." Izuku wanted to make a noise of protest. Then he saw that the man had been looming over them. His small heart dropped at the sight, clanging noisily from where it smashed into his ribs. Kaken was unaware of this as his back was turned, unaware of how the man was looking at him. So Izuku had to warn him, he had to get him away. But when the hidden boy scrambled to grab his friend, the attention of those chilling eyes switched to him and Izuku froze. The man was regarding the boy's wide green eyes bleakly, and Midoriya didn't want the attention anymore. He was so scared, he was terrified. And suddenly, the boy found himself praying that the man's focus would return to Kaken. Because Kaken can handle it. Kaken's strong. Needless to say, Midoriya regretted his pleas immediately after when the man grabbed the blonde boy and tugged him backwards, so he let out a terrified scream. Izuku watched in silent horror as the man, and he could hear Kaken screaming and crying, calling to Izu-chan for help, calling out for his mum, begging him to stop screaming that it hurt so much, and in a sudden fit of hysteria the man hit Kaken over. There was so much blood he wouldn't stop. Jiru let out a loud sob. Midoriya watched as she buried her face into her hands, unable to handle the monstrous memories he was arousing from the darkest depths of his mind. Midoriya curled in on himself, bringing his legs up to feel a little safer in his own skin. He looked down at the ground, not wanting to see anyone's expression. He trailed off, annoyed at how weak his voice was. "I was too scared. I couldn't move. I just watched. Even after the man left, and I didn't even. Kaken was bleeding on the floor and I couldn't move. I just cried and called for him, and I was so..." He wasn't answering. "We were found the next day. Apparently, I passed out from shock." Pathetic, he felt his fingers dig into his thighs. "Kaken almost died there, just because I couldn't move. If they found him minutes later, he would have. They said he needed surgery. I didn't see. The man had a knife. Doctors said he was going to be fine. But they didn't know. They didn't know what happened. I didn't even know. I couldn't understand it." Yu spoke up in a haunting whisper. "Is that why towards you he's so?" She trailed off, unsure of how to structure her words. "Does he blame you?" "No," Izuku shouted. He rocked himself a bit so he could calm down. "And no, Kaken, not at first." Izuku trailed off, unsure of how to explain, then decided the easiest way would be to say more of what happened. Midoriya gripped his mother's hand tightly as they sat in the worn seats of the waiting room. The small boy crinkled his nose at the crisp smell of disinfectant that wafted through the pristine, chalky building. He watched as people in cloaks of white bustled around the area as if they were too busy to slow down, and yet they held an air of propriety and sophistication. Kaken would hate a place like this. He must be so angry at me. Because I'm the reason he's here. Izuku felt his mother gently squeeze his hand, and he looked up into her caring eyes. She offered him a kind smile. "Don't worry, you'll see him soon." Midoriya nodded before looking back down at the ground, waiting for that moment to come. It came sooner than expected as a female doctor with a gentle smile beckoned them, saying that they could see the patient. Midoriya felt his face screw up at the name. It's not a patient. It's Kaken. But not wanting to miss his chance to see his friend, Izuku ignored the rude title, hopped out of his seat immediately, and followed the woman. As they were being led to Kaken, the doctor made conversation with Midoriya's mother. They talked about how Kaken had been unconscious for 3 days and had just woken up 2 days ago. The woman also mentioned how it was unusual to get visitors outside of the family during the recovery period, but since the patient's guardians asked specifically for it, it could be allowed. Midoriya couldn't care less what they were talking about. He just wanted to see his friend, and for the women to walk faster. But he did listen in about the part on 𝐭𝐽𝐻𝐿's parents. The boy couldn't even let his green eyes meet the fierce gaze of 𝐭𝐽𝐻𝐿's mother when she visited them. She reassured him that he wasn't to blame for what happened, but it was the man who hurt them that was at fault. She reasoned with him that he didn't need to be scared because the evil bastard would be caught soon. He was told about when she visited 𝐭𝐽𝐻, that he was fine and recovering quickly, but he couldn't help the ugly rope of guilt that would wrap around his throat, blocking his airways whenever he saw her. Because she was forced to visit her child in the hospital, and 𝗧𝗑 felt his tears welling up whenever he thought of his own mother having to do the same. It was even worse that her eyes were just like 𝐭𝐽𝐻's, the same eyes that showed so much hurt and pain, desperate and pleading for someone to save him. 𝗧𝗑, were here. The boy blinked as his mother's voice lulled him out of the tangle of his thoughts. You were mumbling the entire way here, she said curiously, never remembering that to be a habit of the boy before. 𝗧𝗑 couldn't focus on his mother's words at the moment because he saw a big white door in front of him and wondered how he got there. The small child stepped back, suddenly scared of what he would meet on the other side. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 will hate me. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 will hate me. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 will hate me, unaware of the torrent of thoughts that was clouding her son's mind. The boy's mother pushed open the doors and led 𝗧𝗑 into the room. Blazing red met emerald green, and 𝗧𝗑 felt himself shrinking as he saw anger in those eyes. Why'd you take so long to come? The voice boomed. 𝗧𝗑 blinked dumbly, confused at how normal the boy seemed despite everything. His mother laughed and walked up to the blonde boy to hug him. Nice to see you too, Katsuki. The boy squirmed slightly in her hold, and 𝗧𝗑 could have sworn that he saw a slither of fear in 𝐭𝐽𝐻's eyes. He quickly shook his head. That's silly. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 isn't afraid of anything, but then he remembered the boy's eyes on that day and the boy's screams, and the only emotion one could use to describe them was that they were drowning in overwhelming, suffocating fear. 𝗧𝗑 snapped out of his thoughts when he saw his mother frowning at him. 𝗧𝗑, you're mumbling again. When did you start doing that? She asked. No one in particular. Just don't make it a habit. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 was staring hard at Midoriya with an unreadable expression before he turned away. I'll go and get you boys some snacks. I'm sure Katsuki could use the break from hospital food. 𝗧𝗑 paled as he saw his mother stand, walk to the door, open it and leave. Now they were alone, and there was silence. 𝗧𝗑 started crying loudly and 𝐭𝐽𝐻 jolted in surprise. Then the blonde boy rolled his eyes and held out his hands. You're seriously always crying? 𝗧𝗑. Midoriya looked at the boy's outstretched arms and cried harder. Without a second thought, he ran forward and struggled to scramble onto the large hospital bed. He moved fast to hug the boy. Then 𝐭𝐽𝐻 flinched. They both froze in surprise at the reaction. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 growled suddenly and hugged the other with strong force, obviously annoyed with the blatant show of vulnerability. The hug was quick and uncomfortable because 𝐭𝐽𝐻 was pushing Midoriya away immediately after, and 𝗧𝗑 whimpered in unsatisfaction at the embrace, remembering the previous ones he shared with 𝐭𝐽𝐻. They were always rare and came randomly, but the freckled boy always found himself cherishing them, because 𝐭𝐽𝐻's hold was always reassuring and strong, making 𝗧𝗑 feel safe and content. But this was different. The thought made 𝗧𝗑 start crying again. He couldn't help but think that 𝐭𝐽𝐻 wouldn't attempt to hug him again. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry, the sobbing boy chanted. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 stared at him for a few seconds, letting the boy calm down from his frenzied cries. When Midoriya's loud sobs finally went quiet and his tears only left small trails of liquid down his cheeks, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 spoke. I don't care. You were scared, so it's fine. 𝗧𝗑 shook his head and sniffled. But you were calling to me for help. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 cut off his words quickly. And no, I was. It was stupid. You're Deku. Someone like you couldn't help me. Midoriya tried to ignore just how much those words hurt. But it was true. He didn't help 𝐭𝐽𝐻 at all. I should be enough. I'm gonna be a hero. I can protect both of us. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 mumbled to himself. 𝗧𝗑 bit down on his lip. But what that man did. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 went stiff as Midoriya formed his words. I mean, other than hitting you. He also. I don't really know what. It was. I don't know. Like dirty. Midoriya stuttered and stumbled over his words, unsure of what he really saw and how to describe it. Apparently those were the wrong words because 𝐭𝐽𝐻 was suddenly grabbing his shirt. It wasn't. I am not dirty. Nothing happened. Midoriya was surprised at the panic inside the boy's voice. It wasn't like the boy was trying to insult 𝐭𝐽𝐻. It was just the only description that came to his mind. But 𝐭𝐽𝐻, the man, and it looked painful. We have to tell someone. An adult. We have to tell them what happened. How the hell would you know what happened? You were hiding like a coward. 𝐭𝐽𝐻's panicked shout felt like a slap to the face, and 𝗧𝗑's eyes watered as he looked away. The room was drowned in silence again. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 sighed quietly. 𝗧𝗑, don't get upset. Midoriya felt his lip wobble, but he refused to look at the other boy. You do blame me. You're angry at me. More silence. 𝗧𝗑, look this way. 𝗧𝗑 turned his face hesitantly to see 𝐭𝐽𝐻 pulling a silly face. It was so random and out of place that Midoriya found himself laughing out loud. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 also chuckled slightly. When Midoriya was finally able to catch his breath, the room went silent again. I'm not angry. I just... You think I'm strong, right? 𝐭𝐚𝐲 asked, voice doused in uncertainty. Izuku's eyes gleamed and he felt a surge of passion rush through him as he whipped around to look straight into 𝐭𝐚𝐲's eyes, a wide smile on his face. I think you're the coolest, strongest person ever. Like you could win against anyone. Both boys tried not to cringe, knowing that the blonde was in the hospital because he couldn't win against anyone. 𝐭𝐚𝐲 laughed and puffed up his chest. Yeah, I'm awesome. Izuku clapped and giggled. It went silent again and 𝐭𝐚𝐲 decided to break it. So if I'm strong, you gotta believe me when I say nothing happened. Something like that. It wouldn't happen to someone strong. Izuku shook his head. 𝐭𝐚𝐲 is strong, but he can still get hurt. The curly-haired boy wanted to voice his thoughts but snapped his mouth closed when a warning glare was sent his way. So Izuku stayed quiet about the topic and talked about something else to 𝐭𝐚𝐲's relief. He ignored it when his mum came back with food, ignored it when they left the hospital, ignored it on the drive home, and ignored it when he was tucked into bed. But Izuku was struggling. He wanted to believe 𝐭𝐚𝐲's words, but he couldn't, because his dreams wouldn't ignore it. He was plagued with nightmares of the scene every time he slept and woke up screaming that 𝐭𝐚𝐲 was dying, that he was hurt and in pain and bleeding. His mother watched in horror every night as her son's body was frozen stiff despite being awake, unmoving and haunted because of a phantom with daunting ash eyes. He didn't blame me. He never did, really. I think he blamed himself more. Izuku spoke quietly, believed that he was too strong to hurt, even though he was. Hurting Midoriya heard a sniffle but didn't want to look up. If he did, he might burst into tears again. He hated that he wanted to cry when he wasn't even the one in pain. He tried to make sure his voice didn't wobble and rubbed angrily at fresh tears forming on his eyes. He hates me because of what happened after. Izuku didn't want to go to school, not when 𝐭𝐚𝐲 wasn't going to be there. But that didn't stop his mother continuously attempting to coax him into doing it, saying that 𝐭𝐚𝐲 would be back within a week as he was getting discharged soon. She clicked her tongue when Izuku stubbornly crossed his arms, declaring that he wasn't going. You're really learning from Katsuki. The woman sighed at her son's attitude. Do you want me to call him now? I'm sure he wouldn't be happy to know you're missing school because of him, she challenged. Izuku paled and shook his head, already imagining the boy's annoyed expression. His mother chuckled slightly, relishing in her victory. So here he was sitting in a classroom without 𝐭𝐚𝐲, surrounded by kids who weren't 𝐭𝐴, yet wishing that they were. The small boy realized just how much he relied on the blonde boy's presence, the presence that was almost removed from his life forever. Midoriya cringed at the chilling thought. He could barely listen in his lessons and was getting told off frequently by the teacher for his incessant mumbling, a habit he picked up ever since the incident. By break time, Izuku's head was swirling and he felt like it was about to explode. So where's Katsuki? Midoriya snapped out of his thoughts as he looked up to see a taller boy with brown hair and eyes staring down at him expectantly. The green-haired boy racked his brain, wondering who this boy was and why he was talking to him. Then it clicked. It was one of 𝐭𝐴's friends. Izuku couldn't recall the boy's name as he had never made an effort to have a conversation with him before, but he did remember the boy making fun of him and trying to push him away when he hung out with 𝐭𝐴. Ugh, why are you mumbling? You're so weird. Did you even hear what I said? The boy spoke in an impatient and annoyed tone. Midoriya blinked. He didn't want to dislike the boy since he was 𝐭𝐴's friend, but he was kind of mean. The boy nodded so his green curls jumped with the movement. 𝐭𝐴 is in the hospital. Midoriya spoke hesitantly. The boy's brown eyes shot wide open and his lip pulled into a smile. What? He got hurt? Wow, guess he's not as tough as he makes himself out to be. So, what happened? The boy spoke excitedly. Izuku's stomach twisted uncomfortably at the boy's words and didn't like how he asked the question as if it was interesting gossip. But this is 𝐭𝐴's friend. He's probably just worried. Maybe he'll be able to help understand what happened. So Izuku told the boy. He told the boy everything he saw and how he was confused about what it meant, wondering if he could help. Midoriya watched as 𝐭𝐴's friend's face twisted in disgust. What the hell? That's disgusting. Izuku couldn't fight the feeling that something was wrong. It was all so wrong. The disgust could have been directed at the man who hurt 𝐭𝐴, but Izuku wasn't so sure. Midoriya's doubts were answered when the boy formed his next sentence. Can't believe I'm friends with someone so dirty. Midoriya felt his heart drop at the descriptor, the one 𝐭𝐴 had gotten so offended by when he visited him in the hospital. My dad says people who do stuff like that are. What was it? Midoriya watched with horror-filled anticipation as the boy deliberated over his words like it was a fun game. Oh yeah, Katsuki is a slut, he declared. The boy turned around and shared his newfound discovery with the entire class. Midoriya didn't understand the word. The boy didn't understand. The class didn't understand the word. But that didn't stop them from saying it over and over again, seemingly happy that the strong boy that was always ahead of them was finally knocked down a peg. Because even if they didn't fully understand the word, they liked thinking that Katsuki Bakugou was now dirty, that he was now a slut. Midoriya would never forget 𝐭𝐴 entering the classroom, expecting to be welcomed and acknowledged due to his return from the hospital. How he waved with a wide smile on his face to greet his friends, then frowning slightly when they slapped his hands away, saying not to touch them. His friends laughed in his face at his confused expression, saying that he shouldn't touch them because he's dirty. Midoriya stood up and shouted for them to stop because Kaken's body went stiff. They ignored the plea and said that he was a slut. Kaken looked at them with wide eyes, and then the entire class started chanting the word over and over again. Kaken stumbled backwards as if he had been slapped, but they didn't stop. Then his eyes met Midoriya's, and Midoriya let out a loud sob. The way he looked at me, he looked so betrayed. The words could barely get past his lips. He heard Yaoyorozu whisper from beside him. They called him that. The incredulous manner in which she spoke made him sob louder. They were just kids, didn't even understand what it meant. But when I saw Kaken's face, I could tell that he knew. He's always been smart like that. And everyone else could see that he knew, too. So it didn't matter that we didn't understand, because his reaction was enough to tell them that it was something horrible. Midoriya explained, trying his best not to stumble over his words. The raven-haired girl shifted slightly, then looked down at the ground. That's awful. Remembering the way the class had started mistreating Kaken, all because Izuku couldn't be a good friend and keep his mouth shut, the freckled boy couldn't help but think that the past was repeating itself. Izuku finally willed himself to look up at his classmates' faces, fearing that he would see the same disgusted expression that Kaken's old friend wore. Izuku blanched as he realized all their faces were unreadable. Mina had hid her head in her hands and was avoiding comfort from anyone. Todoroki had leaned back and gently stroked the red scar on the left side of his face. It seemed that Kirishima was out of it because he was staring ahead at nothing. The boy also noticed that there was a large portion of expressions he couldn't see, like Tokoyami with his bird-like features, and Shiro because of the long black hair that covered his face, or Hagakure due to her quirk. Midoriya shivered because he didn't know what they were thinking. What if they thought Kaken was disgusting? What if they called him that too? Izuku shook his head. He knew he couldn't let that happen. He needed to make sure they knew, needed to make sure they understood. The boy forced himself to talk further. He had already started and was now willed on by paranoid thoughts that if they didn't understand just how much Kaken had been through, how much it had affected him, then they might not take the blonde's suffering seriously, allowing themselves to make remarks and comments that would surely destroy the confident boy. Izuku couldn't let that happen, so he had to make sure they could fully comprehend everything. Because there was still so much more to this story. Ever since that day, Kaken had become quieter. He avoided speaking or calling attention to himself, scared of being called that word again if he got too loud. Izuku would just watch him as he closed off from everyone else. It was scary to see how the burning flame inside the boy had died away, leaving nothing but withering embers. Sometimes Kaken would look up at him and their eyes would meet. Then he'd break his gaze away as if Izuku was too horrible a thing to look at. Midoriya couldn't handle being so separated from Kaken and being the cause of his friend's social withdrawal. He tried to talk to him once during break, when the boy was sitting in a corner outside out of other people's vision. Kaken, Izuku tried. He bit down hard on his lip when the boy ignored him, turning his head away. Kaken, can't we play together like before? I'm really sore. Hey, Deku. A loud voice called and startled both of them. Izuku turned to see a brunette-haired boy with brown eyes, the cause of everything, who he now knew to be called Haru. Hey Haru-kun. The timid boy responded. The taller boy regarded the scene in front of him and frowned. What are you doing hanging around with the slut? Kaken flinched and curled in on himself. You should stay away from him. Midoriya couldn't help but frown. The boy had been so quick to ostracize the blonde that Izuku couldn't help but wonder if he had hated Kaken all along. He had started making fake shows of friendship with Izuku in front of Kaken, but otherwise acted like the green-haired boy didn't exist. You're really disgusting, you know. Haru turned his attention over to the blonde. Deku here told me all about what happened. Probably would have been better if you hadn't made it to the hospital. Midoriya let out a horrified gasp. He felt his eyes prick as he realized what the boy had been implying with his words. Kaken stood up and Izuku was hoping that he would defend himself, shout and scream like he used to, say that he wouldn't let anyone talk to him like that. But the boy just looked down at the ground and clenched his small fists. Haru scoffed. You always acted like you were better than everyone, but now everyone knows the truth. Kaken tried to walk away, but Haru wouldn't leave him alone. Everyone knows that you lied. The boy pushed Kaken so he stumbled back. That you're not strong. He pushed him again, with more force. That you're weak. All of a sudden Kaken was on top of the boy. He started hitting him with clenched fists. His blows were frenzied and wild, and he didn't let up even when blood was coated over them. Izuku shouted, saying that Kaken should stop before he hurts the boy too much. But it was as if the boy's ears were blocked. He screamed as he beat up the boy underneath him, the boy that was supposed to be his friend. And then boom. Izuku froze as he saw smoke rise from Kaken's fist, small explosion popping in his palms and searing off the delicate skin there. But Kaken seemed too out of it to notice the pain, too immersed in hurting the boy who had dared to insult him, degrade him, call him weak. Midoriya watched in horror as Haru screamed out in pain. Watched as aching bruises became unforgiving burns, because 𝐭𝐽𝐻 was burning the boy. Though the damage was done in small bursts, he was burning him. But it wasn't even 𝐭𝐽𝐻's brutality that made him shiver in fear. It was the fact that 𝐭𝐽𝐻's eyes were so dead that one could mistake the scarlet orbs as desolate gray. Izuku screamed. A teacher came rushing and paled when they saw the scene. He attempted to pull 𝐭𝐽𝐻 away, but the blonde hit and kicked, letting off explosions that the teacher backed away from. More adults were called and tried to detain the boy. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 was grabbed and pinned down like a dangerous animal, and he screamed and cried, his once emotionless eyes now glowing in panic. But the adults held no sympathy for him, shoving him down onto the rough gravel and worrying over the boy whose body was littered with bruises and burns. Midoriya is sure that someone asked him something about whether he was okay or if he was involved in the fight. But his mind was so empty and yet so full, too jumbled to formulate words. So he stared silently, once again watching 𝐭𝐽𝐻 being forced down by an adult, and once again being useless. Paralyzed, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 had gotten in a lot of trouble because of what he did. He was being constantly scolded for his actions, told that they were wrong and brutal. Izuku couldn't help his anger towards his teachers, who had seen 𝐭𝐽𝐻 getting bullied constantly but had never decided to say anything until it was time to reprimand the boy. Parents were called and were sat down in an office with the children involved sitting at the side of the room. When the blonde's mother came, she was bubbling with terrifying anger. She had gritted her teeth as she apologized to the injured boy's parents, saying that she was deeply sorry. And they responded back by shouting insults towards 𝐭𝐽𝐻, saying that he was a dangerous animal and that she should raise her son better. Midoriya couldn't help but think that they were hypocrites. The blonde woman had tried to stay calm while the two adults insulted her son and was reasonable all throughout the conversation. But her anger could only be held back for so long. Though I'm sorry for my son's actions. Meeting the kid's parents, I can probably guess what could have made Katsuki so angry. She said simply, "How dare you? Have you seen what happened to my little boy? If you have any ounce of shame, you'd put that monster into a mental institution." Haru's mother screeched, "I am very sorry for what happened to your child. He didn't deserve to be injured to that extent, and I would like to pay for all medical fees that may come up." The blonde woman spoke formally. "However, I would advise you to fuck off and never talk about my son like that again." The man who had stood behind the raging woman stepped forward. "I think it's obvious to see that there is something wrong with your child. It would be ignorant to ignore that problem and continue to allow him to remain in school as he is a danger to others." The woman seethed. "There is no problem, and Katsuki is not a danger. He is going to keep showing up at school no matter what you say. Once again, sorry for what happened to your son. Have a good day." The woman spun around and marched away. She stormed over to 𝐭𝐽𝐻 and glared down at him from where he sat, expecting him to look up at her with a similar defiant gaze. But the boy just stared at his hands, rubbing thumbs over the blistered skin of his palms. The woman sighed and pulled him up by his wrist before walking out of the room, with 𝐭𝐽𝐻 trailing behind. When Midoriya was finally allowed to leave, his mother had fired many questions at him, her green eyes lit with worry, and Izuku tried his best to answer, but he was zoning in and out of the conversation. Realizing the exhaustion of her son, the woman simply made him a meal before allowing him to go to bed. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 came back to school within the following weeks, but Haru didn't. The atmosphere had changed when he had come back. The class avoided him still, but rather out of fear than anything else. The only one who didn't seem to notice the change was the blonde boy himself. As days passed, quiet whispers of fear became whispers of awe. They stopped mentioning what they had been told, refusing to believe that the blonde could have ever been weak in the first place. And people started trying to talk to the boy. They had even started following him around. Izuku could see that 𝐭𝐽𝐻 was at first shocked by the sudden shift. How all the people who were once shouting at him with insults were now shouting with praise. How their eyes gleamed with awe when his hands crackled with the explosions of his newfound quirk. But then 𝐭𝐽𝐻 started relishing in it. His red eyes roared with passion again, but it was somehow different. His slumped shoulders stood with pride again, but it was somehow different. His forgotten smile once again stretched into a grin, but it was somehow different. Midoriya was the only one to notice that 𝐭𝐽𝐻 was different than before. He no longer called people his friends. He had started treating them like underlings. And he started being obsessed with not letting anyone outshine him, riddled with paranoia and distrust. The boy had become meaner, more of a bully, and he intimidated and hurt. He hurt Izuku. In the first days of his return, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 had avoided him like the plague. But Midoriya had been persistent in his approaches, naively thinking that now that the problem was solved, they could rekindle their friendship. The punch that knocked the wind out of his stomach was enough to show that he was mistaken. Izuku gasped and fell to his knees, clutching his aching gut as tears formed in his eyes. When he finally caught his breath, he looked up to see his childhood friend standing over him. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 looked down at him with an unforgiving glare of crimson. "I'm not your friend, Deku." The boy spat the word like venom, and Midoriya couldn't help but flinch. Izuku had always known that the name wasn't the nicest. It was a title given to someone weak and useless. but he had found himself being proud of the name that Kakin called him. The boy had always said it rather fondly, as if Midoriya was an annoying brother who was clumsy and blundering, but they both knew he never really meant it to be bad. But now hearing the boy say it with so much hate and spite as if it belonged to a disgusting pest, Izuku realized just how much he'd lost with Kakin. Others in the surrounding area saw the scene and took it as a fight. They came crowding in to cheer Kakin on, shouting that he should hit the other boy more. But the blonde didn't move, he just stared down into Green Eyes, because they both knew. The punch in his tone was enough, much more meaningful than anything else. They were enough to say that the beautiful friendship that the boys once shared had dissipated with the wind, riding on the breath of the words that were uttered from Izuku's mouth, the words that Kakin urged him not to speak. Unaware of the silent separation of the boys, the surrounding crowd cheered, guessing that the blonde had come out victorious. Kakin turned and walked ahead, and they followed him. At that moment, Izuku understood what was different about the blonde. He had returned to being an image of strength in the class, but he was no longer a part of them. The boy was surely still feeling the lingering embers of betrayal, and so he made himself separate from all of them, never allowing anyone to know a single weakness, a seemingly strong and unstoppable force. Izuku sobbed as he stared at the back of his friend, because he had fooled everyone that he was something that could never be hurt. He had fooled them into thinking he wasn't human. I've never blamed Kakin for the way he acts, Midoriya uttered with bitter realism, because I'm the one who made him like that. Izuku saw a half-toned head shake from the corner of his eyes. I don't think you should blame yourself so much. It's not something you could thank Todoroki. Midoriya attempted a smile, but I think it's pretty clear whose fault it is. The boy was surprised when he felt hands grip his own, as he didn't notice anyone approach him, and then guessed that the person who took him by surprise was Hagakure. I agree. I don't think you should blame yourself for any of it. She spoke confidently. Midoriya shook his head and smiled to himself. They still don't get it. They don't understand. Kakin's eyes had changed since then. Izuku had memories of orbs burning alight with fire and passion, so intense and spirited yet warm that one couldn't help but admire them. But they had now become roaring flames of fury, expressing his rage and hate and acting as signals to warn others of the danger of the scalding fire, for others to stay away. But Midoriya sometimes found himself being thankful for this. He would rather vengeful red than unforgiving gray. Izuku took every hit and every insult all the way up until middle school because he knew he deserved it. He should have been used to it. He was used to it. So why take a swan dive off the roof and wish for a quirk in your next life? Midoriya bit down hard on his lip and stared at the floor, unable to meet such familiar eyes that were currently staring at him with overwhelming hate. He was unsure how much time had passed, but Kakin had still not gone away. For some reason he didn't leave, even when his underlings had left the room. There was silence, and it was unbearable. So Izuku dared to look up and meet Kakin's eyes. He was surprised to see no anger there. The boy just seemed to be analyzing him, sizing him up. Then he finally spoke. You want to get into UA? Huh? He questioned, still planning on being a hero after all this time. There was a slight hint of reminiscence in his voice. Midoriya's eyes widened as a torrent of memories rushed through his head. They were all happy, and with Kakin when they were young and carefree. He wanted to return that time, before Kakin had hated him, before meeting the gray-eyed man. Where did everything go wrong? You know exactly where it went wrong, Deku. Midoriya snapped out of his daze due to Kakin's cold voice. Don't act like you don't. Had I been talking out loud? The boy's eyes went wide and he stumbled backwards when he saw Kakin marching up to him. The blonde grabbed him by his collar and slammed Midoriya into the wall, twisting the material so that he let out a cough and was struggling for air as he tugged on calloused hands. Kakin had allowed him just enough space to breathe, but not enough for comfort. You can't be fucking happy with following me into middle school. The blonde spat. You think someone like you can enter UA? What? Want to ruin my life there too? Midoriya shook his head helplessly, hoping for the blonde to calm down, but that just made his grip tighten and the boy coughed again. Don't fucking lie, Deku. Don't fucking lie to me. I know how you're always watching me, waiting for me to mess up, just so you can go running and tell everyone what a weak, pathetic loser I am. Kakin gasped and wheezed as if he was the one whose air was being restricted. That's what you've always been like. You think you're better than me. You fucking pity me. That's why you told, isn't it? Isn't it? The blonde gasped again and his hysteria allowed his grip to loosen, but Midoriya stayed in place, staring wide-eyed as the boy came undone. Everyone called me a slew. They called me that word. And you were fucking laughing, weren't you? You wanted it to happen. That's why you did it. You got everyone on your side. Everyone's always on your fucking side, Deku. Even the fucking teacher. Even the teacher believed you. Midoriya furrowed his eyebrows, confused as to why he was mentioning their teacher from kindergarten, who he had always remembered being rather kind, and bitch wouldn't stop fucking touching me. Said I was that word too, that I should shut up and stop whining cause I was used to it. Izuku let out a choked breath. He felt liquid build up and flow from his eyes at the implication of the blonde's words. 𝐭𝐚𝐲, again, because of me. 𝐭𝐚𝐲, all of you, you think I'm just weak and useless, even when that man, you just wanted to show me, wanted to make me understand how worthless I was. That's why you let him do it, staying fucking safe while you wished I would suffer and die. Midoriya cried out and shook, his body trembling with his sobs. No, 𝐭𝐚𝐲, I would never. Please just listen. The blonde let out a bitter laugh, eyes wide, crazed and desperate. But I'm not weak. I'm fucking not. I'll show you just how strong I am. I'll show you how much better I am than you. The best, better than all might, better than anyone. No one will ever dare to call me that again. The grip around Izuku's neck tightened again and he could only gasp out in fear. I said you should kill yourself, but don't. Don't fucking dare to. First I'll show you just how useless you are. How weak and pathetic. I'll make you understand exactly why your name is Deku. You don't need to die. You don't need to. The boy laughed and shook his head. You're already dead to me. After you understand that, after you feel like the piece of shit you are when you see how superior I am to you, then you can die. Midoriya was dropped to the ground and he gasped and coughed, his hands wringing around his throat as he forced air back into his lungs. 𝐭𝐚𝐲. The boy's green eyes could only see black shoes in his line of sight, and watched as they turned to walk away. The slam of the door made him jump in surprise, and he was suddenly aware of the wetness on his cheeks. Midoriya lifted himself so his back rested on the classroom wall, but he didn't get up. He just stared blankly as his breathing gradually returned to normal, stood himself up and gathered his stuff before walking out silently, no strength left in his body to wipe the tears from his face. Fuck, 𝗧𝗪 rasped. He sounded so. The boy trailed off. He didn't need to finish his sentence. Midoriya was sure they were all thinking the same thing. Broken. Izuku looked down and wringed his scarred hands. Whether he meant to or not, 𝐭𝐚𝐲 opened up to me. Even if his words were full of hate, they allowed me to understand him a little. And yet, I completely ignored them. The boy rubbed hard at his eyes and sniffled. He told me how he'd proved just how strong he was, and I could see how important it was to him. And yet I still. Midoriya bit down on his lip to silence any sobs trying to burst from his mouth. The sludge villain. Izuku's eyes snapped up and he met Kirishima's wide ones. He nodded quickly and looked back down, feeling his vision blur with unshed tears. And my body moved on its own. The boy whispered, I just saw 𝐭𝐴𝐲's eyes and they looked the same. His eyes. Just like that time when we were kids and that man. He looked scared, terrified. And I couldn't handle just watching and being useless anymore. I had to help him. I had to. Izuku felt a sting of pain and realized that his fingernails had drawn blood from his palms. He quickly hid the signs of injury and hunched in on himself. I was being selfish. Oh God. I was being so fucking selfish. I didn't know how much it would affect him. I always end up hurting 𝐭𝐴𝐲 so much. Midoriya was laying wide-eyed in his bed, his green eyes staring at the ceiling of his room as he processed all that had happened that day. He had met All Might, the All Might, who had believed that he could fulfill his dream, that he could be a hero. And Izuku was going to receive one for All Might's quirk. His thoughts were so jumbled that he didn't know whether to feel excited, scared, or anxious. The boy let his gaze trail to his puny fist, the fist that had never been able to fight before, and clenched it, smiling as newfound determination surged throughout his body. I will be a hero, an amazing hero, just like All Might. Midoriya looked up when he heard a knock on his door and saw his mother come in. She spared him a glance and whispered a few words into the phone that was being held firmly to her ear before handing it to him. Izuku, it's Katsuki's mom. She wants to talk to you. Midoriya felt himself grimace. Even after all these years, the guilt he felt still run around his neck like a noose, and just the mention of 𝐭𝐴𝐲's mother left him suffocating and struggling for oxygen. Hello, Auntie. The boy spoke awkwardly, cursing the stutter in his words. Izuku, have you seen Katsuki? A booming voice replied in response. Midoriya felt his blood run cold. He hadn't seen much of the boy after All Might had saved them. He couldn't help but feel slightly worried as the boy had just been recently attacked by a villain. No, I haven't. Why? Is he okay? Izuku tried to keep the worry out of his voice. I swear that brat, he's gonna give me a heart attack one of these days. He was just involved in a villain attack and he thinks he can just waltz out without telling anyone. His father's worried sick. Every time he leaves the house, I always feel like I'm gonna get that call again, saying he's in the fucking hospital after almost being beaten to death by some evil bastard. Her voice trembled slightly and Izuku took in a deep breath at the sudden pang in his chest. It's not like they've caught the guy yet. How the hell am I supposed to know he's safe when that fucker's still out there? Midoriya tried calming the woman down. Auntie, I'm sure 𝐭𝐴𝐲's fine. Don't worry, he's gonna come home soon. It was a bad attempt at reassurance and the boy grimaced at his voice riddled with uncertainty. But the woman didn't seem to notice and let out a sigh. Yeah, I'm sure I'm just overreacting. She let out a loud laugh to lighten the mood. Sorry for going off on a rant there, kid. Izuku could still hear the tremble behind her words and spoke quickly. "I'll go look for him." There was a long silence in return, and Midoriya wondered if he accidentally ended the call. "Thank you." Now Izuku was running around the streets looking for someone who definitely did not want to be found by him. His mother had looked at him quizzically when he suddenly shot out of bed and put on his shoes, but he just gave her a quick kiss on the cheek before saying that he would be back home soon. Midoriya wasn't sure why he had offered to look for Kaken. It was very unlikely that he would be the one to find the boy, and he didn't even know where to start looking. It's not like they were close anymore, so Izuku didn't even know what place the blonde would disappear to. But he searched anyway, spurred on by the tremble in Kaken's mother's voice and the worry weighing in his gut. It had started to get dark, but the sun was still out, so Midoriya wasn't that worried about the time. Where would he be? Where would Kaken? Then it suddenly clicked. Midoriya found himself sprinting faster, for a reason he didn't even know. The thing that was weighing him down wasn't even worry anymore. It was dread. But he didn't know why. He didn't know why, but something inside him was telling him that there was something wrong. Something he had to stop. Izuku climbed up the ladder on the side of the building. It was an emergency exit route that had been installed in case of a fire. Midoriya remembered when Kaken had found it and showed only him. The blonde had said it led to a cool rooftop that would belong to only them. He remembered how they had laughed and yelled on the building's peak, loving the feeling of standing on top and screaming in glory and triumph. And Midoriya had forgotten about the place, until just now. This is stupid, he thought as his hands and feet reached to bound up the ladder. Kaken is probably not even up here. When he finally reached the top, he was panting, out of breath, and his eyes scanned the area to see if there was anyone up there. Then the boy saw a tuft of blonde hair, watched it lean over the edge and disappear behind the worn brick ledge on the side of the building. His heart dropped and his body moved on its own. He scrambled forward, tripping and falling, body unable to handle the speed he moved at. He crawled onward in a hurried frenzy, his body low to the ground and unable to function. When he finally reached the edge after what felt like years, his hands shot out and he grabbed for skin, praying that he would feel the weight of a limb in between his desperate claws. Midoriya let out a loud gasp and sobbed loudly. His hand had managed to latch onto a wrist. The boy dared himself to look over the edge, just to make sure that this wasn't all a cruel joke, and the feel of flesh between his fingers wasn't just a hallucination, that it was real. Surely enough, when he looked over, he saw a pair of blank red eyes looking into his own. He saw that his childhood friend was fine and uninjured and let out a sigh of relief to see that the blonde wasn't hurt in any way. But Midoriya cringed, hating the sight of the boy's body swinging above what could have been a plummet to his death. And so he pulled. But the weight was too much. Kaken, you have to work with me. I'm gonna help you up, okay? Izuku tried, but the blonde just stared up at him blankly, not moving to help in any way as he continued to swing at a length above the unforgiving cement ground. Midoriya let out a gasp when he felt his grip loosen, and he quickly reached his other hand forward to grab onto Kaken's shoulder. The boy let out a loud grunt as he tugged and pulled. "Please, Kaken, please," he cried and pleaded, his heart scattering and thumping erratically due to the amount of times he almost lost his grip. Somehow, Izuku had pulled the majority of Kaken's body over the edge, and with one last tug, the boy's body lay safely on the rooftop. Midoriya gasped and clutched his chest. His breathing was so erratic that he saw white spots enter his vision and he felt like he was gonna pass out. "But I can't, or Kaken might." The boy's head whipped up and his eyes frantically looked for the blonde. His heart calmed at the sight of him, but also panged painfully when he saw that the boy curled up on himself, his head in his hands as he shriveled up where he sat. Izuku crawled forward, too tired to stand up, and reached a hand forward, but immediately thought against it and decided to speak instead. "Kaken, are you okay?" Midoriya cringed at his choice of words. Of course Kaken isn't okay. The blonde stayed silent, and Izuku realized that he didn't even hear the boy's breathing, and even though he was right in front of him, even though he knew it wasn't the case, his mind immediately jumped to grim thoughts that Kaken had stopped mumbling. Nerd Izuku jumped at the sudden gruff voice, and he realized the blonde had unfurled from his position and was looking up at him. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them as neither of them had anything to say. But that wasn't true. Izuku had so much to say. He had so much he had wanted to say to Kaken after all this time. And knowing that he was so close to never being able to voice his thoughts to the blonde, he wanted to just tell him everything, so badly. "But this isn't about me. This is about Kaken. You're so fucking cruel." Midoriya's eyes widened at the raspy words. "I get it now. I get it. I fucking know. That's why I did it. I know." Midoriya felt his eyebrows furrow at the blonde's jumble of words. "Know what, Kaken? What do you am? I know. All right, I get it. Everyone been trying to tell me, but I've been too fucking stupid to understand." The boy gripped at his hair and sobbed, looking down at the ground. Izuku felt his eyes go wide as he watched the blonde, not knowing what he should do. "I know now," he whispered. I know. Midoriya felt unnerved by the blonde's quiet chant and gripped the boy's shoulders, finally daring to touch him in hopes that Kaken would look up at him again. Kaken, What do you know? The boy didn't look up and kept clawing at his head. I'm fucking useless. Izuku felt his heart stutter at the confession and found himself gaping, at a loss for words. You wanted me to understand. Well, I get it now. I'm not fucking strong. I'm weak, stupid, hopeless, useless. Fuck. I should die. Kaken's voice rose with every insult, but his voice reached a hollow whisper when he uttered the last few words. Izuku quickly shook his head as tears sprung to his eyes, but then he realized Kaken wasn't looking at him. He didn't know what to do, knowing that he shouldn't touch the blonde in his unhinged state. Calloused hands dug deeper into blonde hair, and Izuku immediately tugged them away, ignoring his previous thoughts out of worry that the blonde would hurt himself. But he let go immediately after, not wanting to cause the boy any more panic. Kaken cried out again. Ever since that fucker touched me, I fucking knew how disgusting I was. Dirty. He gasped out and scrambled to stand, and Izuku followed the boy's lead, suddenly hyper-aware of Kaken's close proximity to the edge. I just wanted to be fucking strong. But I'm not. Fuck. I'm pathetic. So pathetic. The blonde's hands now scratched at his neck, leaving angry red lines in their wake. No, Kaken. You're not. Midoriya screamed. He wanted to calm Kaken down, but his words were cracked and weak in their volume. The boy's breathing increased, and Izuku quickly realized that he was having a panic attack. So pathetic that even my friend fucking hates me. Midoriya was unsure if the boy was talking about him. Just a pathetic, useless slut. He sobbed. Izuku started shouting now, yelled any reassuring words that came to his mind, but they weren't reaching the blonde. He couldn't hear anything. Smoke rose from the hands that clasped round the blonde's neck, and Midoriya felt his heart drop for the umpteenth time that day. His hands uselessly clawed at Kaken's, and he quickly twisted them away from the soft, vulnerable skin of the boy's nape. The explosion was colossal and sent them both tumbling. Midoriya coughed as dust and rubble invaded his lungs and clouded over his eyes. He forced his eyes open despite how they watered and saw that Kaken was laying near him, unconscious. Midoriya sobbed and let his head rest on the floor again. Even though his vision blurred, he didn't allow himself to sleep, out of fear that Kaken would wake up before him and finish what he started. The boy's body ached and groaned in protest as he stood himself up and stumbled over to the limp body of his childhood friend, waiting away thoughts of how lifeless said body looked. It took a while, but the boy managed to get them both down from the building, only resulting in minor scrapes and bruises due to the difficulty of the descent. Midoriya leaned against a wall with Kaken's arms slung over his shoulder, exhaustion eating away at him. But he knew he couldn't let himself pass out here. It was dark, and Izuku didn't want their unconscious bodies calling any unwanted attention. The green-haired boy decided it would be easier to put Kaken on his back and continued to walk the rest of the way. He grunted and found himself stumbling underneath the heavy weight, but trekked on towards the blonde's house. When Midoriya stood outside of a door and met face to face with a man with brown hair and glasses, he immediately realized it was Kaken's father. The man stared at Izuku in surprise, probably seeing the state both boys were in, but Midoriya was too tired to make up a believable excuse and simply said they had fought when he tried to convince Kaken to come home. He knew he shouldn't have lied. Any parent has the right to know if their child attempted to commit suicide. But Izuku knew Kaken wouldn't want them to know, and his past mistakes of ignoring the blonde's wishes had forced his mouth closed, too guilt-ridden to say anything. The man quickly thanked him and apologized for all the trouble before taking the sleeping boy into his arms and closing the door. Izuku had declined the offer to come inside, too fatigued and craving the feel of his bed. So Midoriya walked back home, albeit stumbling and with difficulty, but he had made it. He had just shook his head at his mother's horrified gasp and ignored her questions about why he had come back home in such a state, collapsing in bed and passing out. The boy didn't see Kaken the entire summer break and spent many sleepless nights wondering over his safety. He couldn't help the way his eyes gazed up at any rooftop, a nagging sense of dread filling up inside him at the thought of seeing blonde hair, peeking over and daring the lethal drop. But he never did. And Izuku could never bring himself to check up on the blonde at his house, too much of a coward to meet face to face with Kaken, and also too busy as he was training with All Might. When green eyes finally met red again, Midoriya could tell something different. Kaken's gaze no longer held the hopelessness it had on the roof, but they also weren't roaring with the same fire he remembered. But Izuku didn't question it too much. Kaken was okay. He was alive. And Midoriya was going to make sure he never messed that up again. Mina had finally lifted her head up from her hands, and she looked at Midoriya with eyes drowning in sorrow. Bakugou tried to kill himself. Her voice trembled and cracked. Izuku made no sound to answer her question. He only offered her a simple nod, squeezing his eyes shut at the sob that erupted from her at the confirmation. The boy's eyes shot open when he heard shuffling. He saw Kirishima shoot up from where he sat and march over towards the door. Midoriya's eyes widened, and he ran ahead of the boy, leaning on the door and regarding the redhead with wide eyes. What are you doing?" Kirishima looked straight through him, seemingly on a path much more important. Move. Midoriya quickly shook his head and Kirishima finally registered the boy's wide eyes. I need to check on him. I need to make sure Bakugou's okay. And no. Midoriya gasped out and Kirishima gave him a look of confusion and annoyance. Why you can't? Every single one. Every person I've told. He trailed off in fear. Kirishima's eyes widened as he realized what the boy meant. Midoriya saw his fists clench as he let out a low growl. Are you saying I would hurt him? No, please don't go upstairs. Izuku found himself fumbling over his words as Kirishima's gaze gradually turned into a glare. What? So everyone has to stay here then? He spat sarcastically and Midoriya flinched at the bitter tone. Seeing this, Kirishima's face immediately softened. I am sorry. I know you're just worried. I get it. You have every right to be. But I just want to make sure he's okay. Both boys turned their heads at the sound of Yaoyorozu clearing her throat. Actually, Kirishima, I don't think that's a good idea. The redhead looked like he wanted to protest, but she quickly spoke again. I'm sure everyone's emotions are frenzied right now, so I feel that talking to Bakugou would only make matters worse. Kirishima scoffed loudly. Did you not just hear what he said? Bakugou needs his friends right now. Ida hastily joined the conversation. I agree with Yaoyorozu. Maybe it would be better if we all slept downstairs tonight so no one is tempted to bother Bakugou. 𝗧𝗏 shouted angrily. How can you say that? For all we know he could be in trouble. And you want us to stay here and do nothing. He could be having a panic attack. Or what if he tries again? Mina made a loud noise of protest and slammed her hands over her ears. Don't say that, she hissed. Izuku watched with paling horror as everyone started shouting over one another, all having opposing views despite sharing the same concern and worry for the blonde boy. I caused this. The room became a cacophony of loud noise. Then a choked sob hushed everyone into silence. All eyes turned to stare at the sniveling blonde with a black streak in his hair. Izuku couldn't help but wince at the ugly bruise that was flowering from the middle of his face. I am sorry. The boy sobbed. I didn't know. I didn't. I didn't mean to make him panic like that. I saw how he was looking at me, but I just ignored it. I thought, oh fuck. He thought I was gonna. I made him think that. The blonde let out a gasp and his eyes widened. What if he does hurt himself? Like 𝗧𝗏 said. It'll be all my fault. 𝗧𝗏 flinched at the mention of his name. No, dude. Ignore that. I was just saying nonsense. He crouched down to where his friend hid his face and reached out to touch his arm. Kaminari, let's get some ice on your face, and we'll visit Recovery Girl tomorrow. Kaminari sniffled and kept his head down as 𝗧𝗏 led him into the kitchen. The sound of the fridge door opening prompted Jiru to break the silence. Maybe we should all sleep downstairs. She spoke contemplatively, frowning in the direction of the kitchen. You know, like Ida said. Everyone turned to look at Kirishima to see his reaction. He sheepishly scratched the back of his head and made a hesitant nod. Yeah, we should probably do that. Izuku let out a quiet sigh of relief and moved from his position in front of the door. He looked at the large clock on the wall and grimaced at the time. 2:30. Ida was quick to point this out and said they should all sleep immediately despite the fact that there was no school the next day. Everyone quickly complied, likely exhausted from the day's events, and made themselves comfortable in the vast space of the common room. Izuku followed suit and returned to his area on the couch, trying to sleep and ignore the nagging thoughts of doubt that ate away at him. Everyone's tired right now and they haven't really processed everything. But when tomorrow comes, the reality of it all will set in. Midoriya couldn't help but dread how they'd react to Kaken, who was completely unaware of his past being exposed to the entire class. The thought made guilt bubble up in his stomach, knowing that the blonde would continue to talk to his friends normally while they stared and whispered about him, worrying over something he wouldn't have wanted them to know. Izuku let his gaze fall to Uraraka. He had avoided looking at her for most of the night, both out of petty anger and guilt for using Kaken's trauma against her in an argument. The girl was unaware of his gaze and she sat still, wide eyes staring at her shaking hands, and he wondered if she had been like that from the moment the words had left his lips. Izuku was sure it was all making sense to her now, exactly why Kaken had said what he did that day, the words that had caused everyone to become so estranged. He couldn't help but feel bad for the gravity quirk user. After all, she couldn't have known. But remembering her words, remembering what she called Kaken, urged the boy to look away from her. He didn't want to offer her any amount of sympathy, so he snuggled in and allowed a wave of exhaustion to wash over him. The waves kept coming in endless torrents, and before Izuku knew it, he was drowning in an ocean of welcoming sleep. Bakugou had slammed his room door shut and gasped as he welcomed air back into his lungs, letting himself rest against the wall. His head spun and his stomach twisted uncomfortably, forbidding him from calming his erratic breathing. A feeling of disgust suddenly surged through the blonde's body, and he bounded for the bathroom, quickly reaching for the toilet seat and emptying the contents of his stomach. It was painful and grotesque. Every time he thought it was done, a sudden surge would run through his body again, and he found himself retching as his crackling palms found purchase on the sides of the toilet bowl. He gagged and tried to lift his head up, groaning at how his stomach twisted in protest, seemingly wanting to keep him there until he vomited out every inch of his insides. But Katsuki refused to lose this fight against his body and forced himself to stand, flushing away the disgusting concoction swirling in the toilet bowl. He staggered towards the sink and turned the tap handle so water came rushing out of its faucet. The blonde quickly used a cover to block the drain and let his hands soak in the water before splashing the droplets onto his face. Bakugou let out a sigh and, too drawn in by the refreshing feel of it all, dunked his head into the water sloshing in his sink. He stayed under for a few seconds longer than necessary before lifting his head out from the suffocating substance and allowing himself to inhale oxygen. The blonde had found that holding his breath had sometimes proved to calm him down, and so, when it was needed, he put himself in situations in which he wouldn't be able to breathe otherwise. Katsuki glanced up at his reflection in the mirror. He gazed at himself for a couple seconds before bringing up a hand to pull at the side of his face. He was suddenly overcome with deep exhaustion and craved the sweet welcome of his comfortable bed. The boy allowed his eyes to graze over the state of the mirror and found himself glaring at dust that had clumped up in its corner. He quickly grabbed a wet towel and rubbed tirelessly at the unhygienic spot, nodding proudly when he pulled it back and saw that it had been destroyed under his powerful wipes. Fucking hate dirt. He thought bitterly. Katsuki had decided that he would go to bed as he had stayed up for far too long, much longer than usual. He turned to walk towards his bed before his movements halted. He was suddenly reminded of exactly why he had stayed up later than usual. The movie night those extras had planned. The boy groaned as with those memories. He was also recalled ruining the night by punching Kaminari in the face. Fuck, he rasped, looking between the tempting softness of his bed and the harsh edges of his door. He knew he should probably go down, not necessarily apologize but clear up any tension that might have been caused by his violent actions. Then Bakugou remembered how someone had shouted his name in scolding, and he let out another loud groan, realizing that there was no chance of might, but rather there had definitely been tension caused due to his actions. The boy ran a hand through blonde spikes and sighed. Whatever, let's fucking get it over with. Katsuki grumbled as he grabbed the doorknob and moved to turn it. But having his hands in his line sight, the boy was suddenly aware of how much they were trembling. Their movements seemed to further stunt in functionality at the thought of returning back downstairs. Then Bakugou realized that his entire body had been shaking and an unbearable feeling suddenly engulfed his very being. It was painful and loud and demanding. It thumped throughout him like a drum, each vibration bringing horrible waves of pain into his body. He quickly stumbled away from the door, hating the overwhelming feeling, and, surely enough, the emotion died down to a dull ache. Yet his body still trembled, and Bakugou immediately recognized the action. He was trembling in fear, scared of facing the blonde downstairs. Katsuki quickly scoffed at his useless paranoia. He knew how strong he was, a powerful force able to overpower practically any one of his classmates, definitely strong enough to fight against Kaminari. Even disregarding that obvious fact, Bakugou couldn't help but feel a small sense of trust towards the blonde. And the thought of being in a situation where he would have to defend himself against the boy felt practically impossible. But wasn't that situation the one he just faced downstairs? Katsuki's eyes widened at the thought. The way the blonde had towered over him and looked at him, anything could have happened. Bakugou felt a sudden surge of sickness again. No, Kaminari would never. He felt a sudden gross discomfort with the trail off of his thoughts. How did he know? People's true colors sometimes came out in the worst possible ways. The blonde bit down on his lip and shook his head. This time it's different. Everyone here is different. Everyone except Deku. A sudden feeling of anger rushed through the blonde at the thought of green hair and freckles. At the thought of Deku, who had somehow always been there to witness Bakugou in his weakest moments. Deku, always watching and waiting for him to mess up. Deku, who hid his sinister intentions behind a bright smile and passionate facade. Even the nerd's friends were insufferable. Always disapproving of Katsuki's actions, always standing up in the green bastard's defense, as if Deku didn't deserve ill treatment, as if he was something special. In fact, Bakugou could recall that it was one of Deku's friends that had started the argument in which he uttered words that made the atmosphere so dense and inhabitable. Katsuki was hunched over his desk, a pen gripped in his hand as he scratched down English sentences and phrases onto a sheet of paper. It was a free study period that Eraserhead had sprung upon them as their last lesson of the day. He had said it was for them to work on anything from the previous lessons that they had been unable to understand, but looking at the yellow cocoon in the corner of the classroom, Bakugou couldn't help but think that his teacher had just wanted to sleep. When the lesson had been announced, a few students in the class had cheered, likely planning to waste the time on redundant things and talk about stupid shit. But not Bakugou. He was gonna focus on his work and use the time to the fullest. At least that's what he had been trying to do. But there was an obnoxiously loud conversation happening right beside him. Katsuki noticed that some of the class had moved to crowd around one table, and his veins popped in anger as he wondered why they had to be so close to him. He couldn't help but grit his teeth to see that they had crowded around Round-Face, or rather her phone. Out of all of Deku's friends, she seemed to be the one that had it out for him the most. So, of course, when he was busy trying to get peaceful quiet and study, the girl couldn't help but bother him, even if it was indirectly. It was hard not to listen in on the conversation as it was so unbelievably loud that the voices practically forced themselves into your eardrums. Did you guys hear? These two women just came out about being sexually assaulted by a small-time hero. Round-Face's voice was the first to enter the blonde's ear. Bakugou froze. His hand's prolonged position had caused a splodge of ink to gather onto the paper around the tip of his pen. Kirishima was the next to talk. Seriously? And it was a hero, too? That's so unmanly. He shook his head in disapproval, a slight frown playing on his lips. That can be anyone. The blonde shifted in his seat and hunched further over his desk as he attempted to finish off the sentence he had started. But his pen scattered over the paper due to his trembling hands, making a mess of whatever work he had completed. Placing the writing instrument down with an annoyed huff, he stared at his palms, without a single object adding weight to them. Katsuki's hands itched to reach up and cover his ears, just to block out the voices surrounding him. But that action would call too much attention. Mina nodded and crossed her arms. It really is. How can a man prey on weak, defenseless girls like that? They're really strong for coming out and exposing him. Bakugou clenched his fists, then stretched his hands out, then clenched them again. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to. Weak, defenseless. She also said strong. Katsuki really didn't mean to. It was like his body had reacted before his mind could catch up to it. He had let out a loud scoff. The sound was already leaving his mouth before he could stop it. And the manner in which he did it, how he had scoffed immediately after Mina's words, made him worry that he wouldn't be able to act like he had made the noise for something else entirely. But who could blame him? How could she even call it that? There was nothing strong about exposing your weaknesses for the world to see. The conversation halted and they turned to look at him. Bakugou also looked right back at them, never being one to turn down a challenge. Kirishima laughed awkwardly and smiled. "What's up, dude?" In response, Bakugou grunted. "Nothing, shitty hair." Mina tilted her head in confusion. "But it sounded like you had something to say." Katsuki sent her a glare, hopefully sending the message that he wanted her to shut up. Round-Face quickly jumped into the conversation. "Yeah, it did, considering how you scoffed really loudly just now." The surrounding students shifted uncomfortably at the accusing tone in the Uraraka's voice, and Katsuki narrowed his eyes. Fuck off. Fuck off. Just leave me alone." Not wanting to shy away from the obvious challenge, Bakugou voiced his thoughts, just couldn't help but notice how raccoon eyes used weak, defenseless, and strong all in the same sentence. Mina spoke up quickly, wanting to dispel any tension. "Oh, I guess that was silly of me." Round-Face crossed her arms. "Yeah, because you're such a saint with how to use words." Her sarcastic tone made a few small explosions go off in his closed fist. "If you have such a problem with what she said, why don't you share your own view about the topic?" Bakugou tried not to show any signs of shock. No, I don't have anything to say about it." He spoke through gritted teeth. "Seems everyone's said enough." "True, I'm sure everyone feels the same. Anyway," Kirishima pointed out with a smile. "Sorry, but I have to ask. Knowing your personality, I thought you had scoffed at the victim's suffering, so I can't help but wonder how you feel about it." Uraraka continued, not allowing the conversation to be left where it was. Bakugou didn't need to feel. He didn't need to feel anything about it. He had already lived it. Just drop it, Round-Face. He growled out, jaw clenched so his voice came out strained and full of warning. She frowned at his obvious displeasure with the conversation, but pressed on with a tone of worry, worried about her temperamental classmates' insensitivity. "But honestly, Bakugou, what would you say if you met face to face with a victim of rape?" All the air felt like it was knocked out of his lungs. Katsuki was sure he was staring at the girl like a deer in headlights. A victim of rape. The gravity quirk user had said the word so easily, the sound rolling off her tongue in simple syllables. And that's what it was, simple, such fucking basic and superficial words. So generalized and cold and uninviting. And it made sense. It's not like the words were supposed to be special. To be honest, they should be anything but. All they did was describe a group of people, a title given to whoever it applied to. The words shouldn't have affected Bakugou that much, but they did. They really did. Because that title belonged to him. He was one of those people, forced into a category because of what another person did to him, forced to be described as something that he didn't even choose to be, just because a few seconds of his life were stolen from him, just because someone had beat him. Now he carried such a repulsive and nauseating name, one that would stay with him forever, because he failed, because he had allowed someone to get the better of him, and he deserved it, for being so weak in that single moment and not coming out victorious. The words were just another way to describe someone who had lost. But despite the overbearing weight those words carried, they could apparently be said so easily, because they were so simple, so fucking inadequate for the devastating meaning they held. But of course they were. What else did a loser deserve? The pain that he felt, disregarded as 4 simple words. The ghost of hands that still had haunted him to this day, so effortlessly described. Words that couldn't even begin to comprehend the panic and fear and terror and dread. Words that would never be able to articulate the inordinate meaning behind the horror of gray eyes. That's what Bakugou deserved. Katsuki realized he had taken too long to answer and his classmates had started to stare at him. Kirishima quickly spoke up in the blonde's defense. Don't you think we should leave Bakugou alone, guys? But the gravity quirk user decided to ignore the redhead's words. Why are you avoiding the question? I don't understand how someone so insensitive to something like assault wants to be a hero. Uraraka's tone rose as she got more upset. Bakugou had decided that he had heard enough. He stood up abruptly and had started packing up his stuff, ignoring the seething girl that was currently shouting at him to listen, to stay, to understand. But he didn't fucking need to. He didn't want to, and Uraraka could see that. But for some reason she was set on the boy understanding her point of view. Maybe that's why she said what she said. The feeling of being vulnerable. She yelled in a final attempt to get a reaction out of the blonde. It's something that women everywhere feel no matter where they go. So, of course, someone like you would never understand. Bakugou zoned out. He doesn't remember exactly what he did after that. He wasn't thinking. He couldn't think. And suddenly he was shouting and screaming so loud that his throat burned in protest. You want to know what I understand? He had managed to gasp out. You fucking bitch. I'll tell you exactly what I think. Why should anyone give a fuck about useless pieces of shit that were too weak to defend their own fucking bodies? No one does. No one did. Why the hell had they been stupid enough to let shit like that happen in the first place? Who else is there to fucking blame? He is. There's nothing more disgusting than pathetic weaklings who can't even protect their own dignity. Low lives like that deserve nothing. Not even fucking oxygen. Disgusting. Pathetic. Weak. Maybe it was silent. Or there was noise but Katsuki couldn't hear any of it. His body was convulsing in overwhelming rage. He couldn't even speak anymore. Everything had become too much. His anger was hot. So hot. And it was burning him, scalding him, scarring him. Explosions erupted from his hands, varying in size and power, reflecting the frenzied jumble of his brain. He wanted to scream or even cry. It hurt. Everything hurt. And, Bakugou, calm down. The blonde felt the tug of bindings pulling on his body and was greeted with the face of his homeroom teacher. Katsuki let out a choked sigh. He was thankful he had been saved from the sight of the infuriating, round-faced girl. The tightness of the capture tape wasn't too restricting and Katsuki allowed himself time to catch his breath. He was suddenly aware that they were no longer inside the classroom, but rather the corridor just outside of it. Bakugou guessed that his teacher had tugged him outside as he ceased and flailed like a raging bull, so that he wasn't a danger to others due to his blind rage. Bakugou was also aware that the door leading back into the classroom was still open, but he couldn't bring himself to peek inside. He didn't want to gaze upon the wreckage he most likely made of the room, or see the reactions of his classmates. Do you want to explain to me why you decided to wreck the classroom? Katsuki flinched at the cold voice that Aizawa had directed at him. He couldn't come up with an answer. Even if he could, he doesn't know if he'd be able to open his mouth and let coherent words flow out. So Bakugou opted for silence. Aizawa didn't take kindly to this, and the man had made sure the boy was severely punished for his outburst. Bakugou clenched his fist as he recalled the numerous detentions and scoldings, not to mention the stares he received. Not even words, as most people had decided he wasn't even worth talking to, and yet that spoke much louder than any insult could. The gazes had been full of so much hate and disgust, as if Katsuki was nothing more than a dirty object. He felt the searing glares sent his way when he spoke too loud, or brought too much attention to himself, the scoffs and whispers, and it annoyed him how he sometimes found himself wanting to be silent, just to avoid the vengeful stares. They'd treated him exactly the same as how he had been back then. They were no different. It would be stupid of Katsuki to trust them so easily. After all, he had believed that Deku was once his friend too. His classmates were probably the same. But if that was true, then they wouldn't have tried fixing things with me. They only did that because Bakugou's number one. Because they think he's strong now. If they knew the truth, what happened to me, Katsuki would be called a slut again. The boy lied on his bed and curled in on himself, terrified at the thought of history repeating itself. He grasped the skin at his neck in agitation, his goal clear in sight. I have to show them. I need to prove how strong I am. He pulled his hand back from his nape and stared at the blood on his fingernails. And be careful of Kaminari. The blonde cringed at the thought, but he found himself agreeing with it. He would never allow himself to lose again. That's what made Bakugou different. Different from all those idiots that came out about being victims, looking for pity yet still wanting to be welcomed as a normal member of society. It was such bullshit. Because of how they'd exposed themselves. No matter what they did or said, everyone would know what happened and treat them differently, being careful not to offend or frighten the pathetic loser in the room. Before, he had believed that he could still be the best despite what happened to him, and that he could move on. But he knew the truth now. But that was idiotic. Something dirty could never become clean. Katsuki knew that one's power was everything, and that true strength wasn't stained by even the littlest bit of weakness, which is why the boy wasn't actually strong. He didn't deserve that title. He could never be that again. That right had been stolen from him the second it had happened. He was already disgusted at himself. He knew how pathetic he was, which is why he couldn't allow himself to do anything but win, as punishment for being stained in such a way that could never be clean. But it was also because he couldn't handle being any weaker than he already was. Bakugou had been so close to ending it once before. The stain that now encompassed his being had been too much, too vile and grotesque. But now, even if it was still there, he found a way to hide it. The people around him knew nothing of his past. They only knew what he wanted them to, what he manipulated them into seeing. So even though there was a rotting corpse hidden beneath the sheen exterior of his personality, even if he would be dirty for all his life, if there was a better, more powerful Bakugou, one that lived in the minds of others, he would happily indulge in it, lamenting over the version of himself that would never be. But it's fucking repulsive. A disgusting fake living among aspiring heroes. Katsuki shivered and pulled his blanket tighter around his frame. They'll notice. Katsuki won't be able to hide for long. He raised one hand to scratch his neck. Bakugou can't remain among them forever. He's different. Both hands were now clawing at his nape. I can't stay. But just for now. Just for now. What if they find out? The blonde gnawed on his lip. They can't. I won't let them. Deku knows the truth. He'll tell everyone. He let explosions pop from his palms and didn't even notice the burns forming on his neck. He knows what Bakugou deserves. He knows what Bakugou should do. I already tried. He's the one who stopped me. Katsuki mumbled. Katsuki had to do it again. The boy squeezed his eyes shut. Something dirty can never be clean. I'll never be. But just for now, I want to act like I'm normal. But when the time comes, when Katsuki can't act anymore, maybe I'll be able to keep pretending. Maybe the time won't come, and I can keep acting. He tried, reasoning with his own mind. It'll happen again. If not by Kaminari, by someone else. The man will come back. Bakugou's body suddenly locked up. The dull ache of fear in him had intensified into a surging pain. He shook his head quickly and let out a pained noise. Katsuki's entire body was trembling now as surges of pulsing ache scattered through his brain. He gripped his head in hopes that it would stop spinning. Red eyes were squeezed shut, expecting to see pitch black, and yet, Bakugou was welcomed with the picture of blank and colorless orbs. He let out a gasp and shot his eyes open. He didn't want to see it. He didn't want to. The boy let out a quiet sob, but somehow his breathing was mellow and dangerously slow. His eyes, wide and haunted. If I continue like this, the blonde talked in a horrified whisper. Again, I can't let it happen. When the time comes, when Katsuki can't act anymore. Bakugou nodded his head frantically as he came to a conclusion and fingernails dug into the skin of his neck. When I can't act anymore. The boy took in a breath, content with the agreement of his thoughts. I'll do it. Weak people don't deserve anything. It wasn't a thought that was new to Bakugou. He had thought about it many times, knew how fucked it was that something as worthless as he was continued to live. But he just needed to be reminded sometimes, when he forgot that the strong and unstoppable version of himself was nothing more than a fantasy. Katsuki was living on borrowed time, too selfish and cowardly to make a second attempt on his life. But he knew his time would run out. There will be a moment where he won't be able to deal with it anymore, being such a pitiful weakling. He won't be able to ignore his past that continues to follow and entrap him. And the boy was sure that he'd go through that experience again. It was inevitable. When everyone sees how weak he really is, he's sure to get taken advantage of. He'll be taught a lesson for pretending to be something he's not, for pretending to be a hero. The victories he had obtained were never truly wins. His insatiable desire to succeed stemmed from the fact that Katsuki could never truly win in life again. So before it would happen again, before he was forced again, even if he deserved it, even if he was being greedy and selfish, he didn't care. Bakugou was already a horrible person. Which is why, when the time came, he would finally win the only way he could. The only way to avoid losing ever again. He would kill himself. That is the only thing Bakugou will finally have control over. Katsuki hadn't slept the entire night. He'd been laying, staring blankly in the darkness. The blonde was never really able to sleep easily. Always spooked awake due to nightmarish images that plagued his dreams. But tonight, he hadn't even been able to rest. He wasn't tired and yet he was exhausted. Not bothered by nightmares but rather by his thoughts. His mind had been empty and yet it was also full. Vacant yet teeming. Tranquil yet pounding. It was such a surreal feeling that Bakugou forced himself out of his bed to get away from it, trudgingly slow due to the weight of his body. He picked up his phone and checked the time. 5:00 a.m. The boy groaned slightly to see that it was already morning. Katsuki staggered into the bathroom with the taste of vomit from last night still fresh on his tongue. He gripped his toothbrush weakly and looked up to gaze at himself in the mirror. The blonde let out a low hiss at what he saw. Blistering burns littered the blonde's neck. Vengeful red lines were scrawled there, most bleeding as they dug in past the abused surface of skin. He reached a hand up to touch his nape and winced at how it burned. "Shit," Katsuki croaked as he further inspected and found that the injuries went all the way down to just beneath his collarbone. "How the fuck am I supposed to hide that?" The blonde had a habit to scratch at himself when anxious. If it got really bad, then his quirk would go off. For some reason, his hands commonly found purchase around his neck or his face, but it had been a while since he had injured himself bad enough that he'd have to hide it. Most people assumed that he got into fights, so that had always been explanation enough. Though looking at the wounds now, which undoubtedly came from his explosions, Bakugou knew that creating excuses for them would be a struggle. "Even if I bandage it, people will still ask questions." The boy bit the inside of his cheek. "And if I go to Recovery Girl, it'll have the same outcome." Katsuki continued to stare at the reflection of the grotesque wound. "Everyone will definitely know how it happened, and then Bakugou would have to end it." The blonde cringed slightly. He wanted to act for as long as possible before that happened. How pathetic would it be if everything ended so soon because of something like this? Bakugou quickly realized that his hand had been raised into the air, reaching for his already injured neck to deal more damage. He groaned in annoyance and allowed his limb to drop by his side. The blonde was aware of how bad his anxiousness was getting and how the effect was becoming worse. It wasn't like this was the beginning of his many sleepless nights. He's been struggling to focus in class, has been more agitated and temperamental, and sometimes found himself overcome with a crippling fear of those around him. It was becoming harder to act like everything was okay. His time was running out. Bakugou disregarded the thought and decided to get ready. It was early, so he found it unlikely that anyone else would be awake. He had been planning on training that day to work on his quirk. The blonde's neck was an angry red due to the boiling water from his shower, and he winced at the pain. Bakugou simply bandaged the area so no blood would seep out and wore a hoodie that covered his neck, just in case. Katsuki was careful as he shut his room door. He scanned the corridor with narrowed eyes and glared at the doors lining the area, daring any one of his classmates to come out. When he was sure the coast was clear, Bakugou walked quietly through the corridor before walking down the creaking stairs. His heartbeat was frantic and his hands were clammy. "Fuck, I don't want to see anyone." Entering the common room, the blonde was shocked to see sleeping bodies. They had slept here, together, after Bakugou had caused a scene and left. Looking at their peaceful faces, Katsuki couldn't help but feel guilty for almost ruining everything again the night before. There was also an underlying feeling in him knowing that his class was perfectly content with the fact that he wasn't there. It had Bakugou rubbing at the area over his heart due to a dull ache. "Katsuki doesn't fit in here. It's fine. He won't stay for long." The boy continued standing there in the tranquil atmosphere. He wondered how different it would be if they were awake. If they could see that Bakugou was among them, someone who had assaulted their friend the day before. Katsuki couldn't help the bitter laugh that left his lips. "They'd treat me even worse than before." He dreaded one of them waking up, imagined how their sleep-ridden eyes would blink lazily, looking around with an unfocused gaze, and maybe they'd even smile in comfort to see their classmates surrounding them. But then they'd freeze, realizing that there was another presence in the room. They'd look at Bakugou and then those eyes would completely change. They'd turn to something ugly and hateful, twisting their faces in disgust at the sight of the blonde. Katsuki cringed at the vision his mind had conjured up. Prompted by the image of a hateful glare, he turned to head for the door. Then he heard a groan. Bakugou's body went stiff. His pulse went wild and he was struggling to control his breathing, wondering if the person would go back to sleep if he remained quiet. "Bakugou," an incredulous voice whispered. Katsuki's eyes went wide. He recognized the voice immediately, and the revelation made his blood run cold. The blonde heard shuffling, and he felt his head pound as it was obvious the person was getting closer to him. Bakugou shouldn't have his back turned to them, realizing that he had put himself in a disadvantageous position by not having his eyes on an enemy. Katsuki whipped around with narrowed eyes and hands ready at his sides. The sight of a black lightning streak in blonde hair made the boy feel sick. Of course he'd be the one to wake up. Bakugou had no time to react to his bitter thought as he saw that Kaminari was just staring at him. His red eyes met the other's yellow ones, but Bakugou found himself snapping his gaze away as a shiver ran through him. He'd imagined the other's eyes losing their pigment, becoming darker, to take on a dull, colorless Bakugou. It seemed that Kaminari had snapped out of whatever daze he had entered, and, as if he had just processed that the blonde was there, he quickly scrambled forwards in Bakugou's direction. Katsuki's eyes widened and he stepped back. "Be careful of Kaminari." The boy could see that no one else was awake, and though a sense of relief ran through him because of that, he was now wishing for the opposite. Anything would be better than this. Denki seemed to notice Bakugou's obvious discomfort because he slowed down to a stop and frowned. Bakugou grit his teeth. "Show you're strong. Make him know." "What the fuck do you want?" Katsuki growled out in a thankfully even voice. On the inside, though, he was shaking. Kaminari continued to examine Bakugou, and it made his skin crawl. A crease formed between the energetic boy's brows. "Are you okay?" Denki asked carefully, making sure to walk forward with slow steps. Seeing the boy this close now, Katsuki could see the ugly purple bruise that decorated the blonde's face. Bakugou tried to ignore the feeling of guilt that bubbled up inside of him. He was just defending himself. Seemingly in protest to his thoughts, the feeling grew the more he stared at the bruise. Realizing what Bakugou had been staring at, Kaminari shuffled awkwardly. The ash blonde watched as he looked down, as if preparing himself to say something. Then, as if he had come to a conclusion, Denki's eyes snapped up to meet his. "I wanted to say sorry." Bakugou's mind went blank at that. I'm really sorry for what I did. I didn't know. I didn't know you'd panic like that. But that's no excuse." The blonde had started rambling. Before Kaminari could open his mouth to form more words, Katsuki cut in. "Why the fuck are you apologizing? I'm not the one who got punched in the face." Denki bit his lip. "It's fine. If anything, I deserved it." Now Bakugou was narrowing his eyes in suspicion. "It's fine." Kaminari quickly nodded his head in unnecessary earnest. "I know you're not the type of person to hit someone like that for no reason. I'm really sorry for scaring you." He's lying. Bakugou snarled slightly. "Why the fuck would I have been scared?" The other froze for a minute, as if he had said something wrong, and the action made Katsuki's mind fill with skepticism. "And not necessarily scared. Just, I get that I made you angry. So I'm sorry." Kaminari stumbled over his words. Katsuki could only stare at the other, confusion running through him. Apparently, Kaminari took this as some small acceptance of his apology, because he walked forward and reached a hand out towards Bakugou. The blonde's mind was overrun with thoughts of panic. Katsuki shouldn't believe him. He's dangerous. The fact that Bakugou didn't move made Kaminari smile, likely thinking that the blonde wasn't bothered by it. At a much faster and confident pace, led his hand to reach Bakugou's shoulder. He's dangerous. Katsuki stood frozen as he watched the blonde, unable to find the connection between the boy and the enemy he'd imagined in his thoughts. Maybe it's fine. This idiot apologized, so it must be. Is Bakugou going to let it happen again? Katsuki's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, and Kaminari's hand fell through the area the blonde once stood in. Is he really stupid enough to believe Kaminari? Bakugou's eyes were wide as he stared at the other, that was now sending him a look of concern. If he's that fucking useless, then he might as well end it now. The blonde clenched his fists, feeling the need to defend himself against the insult his own mind had directed at him. What? Is Bakugou fine with it happening again? Katsuki let out a gasp at that, the feeling of anger leaving him as tears built up in his eyes. No, maybe he's no different from what everyone said he was. That's not true. It's not, he croaked. His hands slammed over his ears and his body shook, trying to block out the voice of his own mind. Maybe Bakugou really is a slut. Katsuki's breathing quickened as he fought back the sobs that tried to sound, clawing at the area around his ears where his hands had clasped over. "Bakugou," Denki shouted out, but the other wasn't responding. The concerned boy reached a hand forward in panic. The blonde slapped the offending claw away and stood straight. "Don't fucking touch me." He had ceased and gasped, words not even reaching the level of warning that he had hoped for. His lack of intimidation made fear grip him. Katsuki's being weak. Kaminari can see it. He's not going to stop. Contrary to what Bakugou thought, Denki stepped back and continued to look at the other with those same fucking concerned, pitying eyes. "Stop fucking looking at me like that," Katsuki hissed, as if. Both of them froze at the sound of shuffling. Someone, maybe even multiple people, had woken up due to the boy's loud shouts. Bakugou was fast to react, glad that something had distracted the other. He quickly whipped around and headed out of the door, slamming it shut behind him. Explosions crackled slightly on the doorknob Katsuki had in the grasp of his hands as he took in deep breaths of the air outside. Not wanting to stay too long, he ran to an area where he could train, even if he would never be strong. When the boy had found the large clearing that he often went to, he started immediately, set on pushing his body to its limit and then forcing it further than that. He offered training rooms to anyone who wanted to use them, but Bakugou didn't prefer them. He liked using his quirk in a place where he wouldn't have to practice any restraint, letting nitroglycerin explode into a large mass of destruction and noise, so bright that it made him blind, so loud that it made him deaf, letting his quirk go rampant as it brought so much relief and joy. This was the one time Katsuki truly felt strong, watching as such an incredible source of power came from him. The blonde let out a laugh as he closed his eyes, remembering all the times people regarded him with fearful eyes when he showcased his frightening quirk, unable to say anything to doubt its undeniable strength. The sweat that coated him didn't stop him. The heavy weight of his body didn't either. All of that didn't matter because adrenaline was running through him. A wide grin graced his face and his mind was blank. Not a single thought, just him and his quirk. Bakugou stopped short when he felt the muscles in his arms ache painfully. He attempted letting off more blasts, resulting in a protesting surge of pain from his arms. Katsuki let out heavy breaths, the interruption making him increasingly aware of his exhaustion. He groaned in annoyance, knowing that this was his limit, that he couldn't go on anymore, meaning that the euphoric state his mind had entered would dissipate and be replaced with aching limbs and depressing thoughts. Katsuki fell onto his back, a feeling of fatigue washing through him. He saw that it was becoming dark and wondered if the whole day had been spent training, then hoped that he'd be able to sleep without any problem due to his exhaustion. The blonde stood with heavy fatigue and trudged back to 𝐒𝐬𝐽𝐳. Bakugou slowed as he got closer to the building. He hadn't left 𝐒𝐻's premises, it was just that the school was ridiculously large, enough to get lost in. A feeling of dread spread through him as he stood in front of the door. Even if it wasn't everyone, the blonde was sure he'd be forced to face at least one person. Trying to empty his thoughts, Bakugou held his breath and pushed on the door. The entrance cracked open with a creak and all eyes turned to him. Not wanting to show his slight panic with just how many people were in the room, Katsuki strode forward, not making eye contact with anyone, just hoping to reach his dorm. Apparently Kirishima had other plans. "Bakugou, where have you been?" The blonde couldn't help but inwardly groan at how the boy thought it was a good idea to start a conversation here. "Out," he replied simply. When he motioned to walk past Kirishima, the redhead moved to block his path. "Everyone's been worried about you. We even went out to look for you." "Lies. That's not my fucking problem," Bakugou growled. "If any of you idiots had a fucking brain, then you would know I always go out to train on the weekend." Katsuki knew he was trying his luck. After hitting Kaminari yesterday, insulting people would only antagonize him further. Surprisingly, Todoroki was the next to speak. "We were aware of that, but Kaminari told us what happened," Bakugou scoffed. "Oh yeah, and what happened?" He sent an accusing glare towards the blonde on the couch that was avoiding his eyes. Kaminari jumped a bit at the sudden address and looked up at Katsuki with wide eyes. Bakugou could see that the boy no longer had a bruise on his face, which he was grateful for since it lessened the guilt. But the redness of the blonde's eyes brought an ugly feeling to his stomach. Denki spluttered in response, trying to form words to explain and not offend Katsuki at the same time. Bakugou simply rolled his eyes and turned to leave, but Kirishima stopped him again. "You don't look so good, dude." He gave him a once-over with concern in his eyes. "Actually, you look horrible, like exhausted." "He looks weak." Bakugou narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, that's why I'm trying to go to fucking sleep. So are you gonna let me? Or are you gonna keep asking shitty questions?" The redhead didn't seem content with simply letting Bakugou go as he furrowed his brows and frowned, opening his mouth to speak again. Katsuki just shook his head and shoved past. "Just leave it, shitty hair." But then he stopped due to a nagging feeling. There had been something that had been bothering the blonde, and it was making him itch with confusion. He spun around and scanned the faces in the room. Bakugou narrowed his eyes slightly. "Don't you guys have something else to say?" Some people seemed surprised by his sudden words. 𝗧𝗲, who had sat on the couch next to Kaminari, spoke with a careful voice. "What do you mean? You fucking know what?" Katsuki growled. The blonde's annoyance grew when 𝗧𝗲 blinked at him in bewilderment. In fact, it seemed that Bakugou's statement had confused everyone. Four Eyes had decided to voice his thoughts. "Bakugou, please clarify what you're referring to." Katsuki could only glare at him. "You're one of the people who's supposed to be mentioning it the most." "You mean?" 𝗧𝗲 was first to catch on. "Because you punched Kaminari." Katsuki shoved his hands in his pockets and didn't bother to answer as looks of realization spread across the room. "Would have expected you to have fucking reported me by now or some shit." Kirishima jumped in. "No, dude, that wasn't your fault." Bakugou raised a brow at the unnecessarily loud tone. "They're lying. Then whose fucking fault is it?" he retorted, and then turned back to 𝐒𝐻. "You're telling me that you're fucking fine with it?" They want Bakugou to trip up. The boy pushed up his glasses and nodded. "It was an accident. It should be fine as long as it doesn't happen again." Katsuki squinted. "Why the fuck do you think it was an accident? No one accidentally punches someone. They want Bakugou to think he's safe and okay." 𝗧𝗲 shook his head and sent the blonde a pained smile. "Seriously, dude, it's okay. Then they'll betray him. Don't fucking lie." The boy seethed. "And they'll laugh that he ever trusted them." 𝗧𝗲's eyes widened at the words, and Bakugou was honestly slightly surprised himself. It was the closest he had been in a while to voicing his thoughts. The dark ones. As if the day couldn't get any worse, Bakugou saw a tuft of green hair enter the corner of his vision. Kakin. No one's lying. Everyone was really just worried, and shut the fuck up, Deku," he hissed. The freckled boy flinched and turned his gaze away. Katsuki could help but raise a brow at Todoroki and 𝐒𝐻, who hadn't said anything about how he had treated Deku, like they usually did. But they only stared back with looks of slight hesitance. Bakugou scoffed. "What? You're fine with that, too?" Katsuki could hear his hands spark in agitation. "Just tell the fucking truth. I'm not some shitty idiot, so stop pretending." Kirishima attempted to calm him down. "What we're saying is the truth. Can you trust that?" "No, Bakugou said lowly. I can't. The redhead tried to hide a hurt expression. Whether he meant to or not, Katsuki had made it clear that it wasn't just the class he didn't trust. He didn't trust Kirishima. I said it was fine. Bakugou turned his head to meet Kaminari's gaze. The other blonde had now stood up and shifted uncomfortably in his spot but spoke with a strained smile. It's already healed, so everything's cool. Seeing that the other was no longer sitting, but now in a more advantageous position, Katsuki stared at the boy with calculating eyes. He could try something. Bakugou had to be careful. The blonde bit the inside of his cheek. Make sure it doesn't happen again. The thought made him feel sick, and Bakugou didn't want to be there anymore. Not with Kaminari. He mumbled a simple whatever before turning to leave, and no one stopped him. When he got to his room, he closed the door gently. Bakugou inspected the edges of the entrance, traced his fingers along the wood, then locked it. He tested the doorknob a few times to make sure it was secure. Then he stepped back, slowly, eyes trained on the object as if it would swing open at any moment and something would jump at him. When he was satisfied, he turned around to breathe in the safe encasement of his room. Now, alone with his bed, Bakugou couldn't help but wonder if he really was going to get any sleep. He lay down and attempted to close his eyes, but they would snap open at the smallest sound, at wind, or creaking of wood, or crinkling of bags in the corner of his room. And his eyes kept fluttering back to his room door, so big and grand where it stood. Staring too hard caused the iridescent dots of black in his vision to scatter and jumble, forming anything he pictured in his mind's eye, even things he didn't want to see. The door looked like a man for a second, and Katsuki had to stare hard to make sure it wasn't moving or speaking, so it wouldn't make sense for it to be a person. Not to mention that it would be impossible for someone to enter his room without him knowing. But the longer he stared, the more features the man took on. Shoes, clothes, a mouth, hair. Bakugou didn't want to look. He really didn't want to. But because he thought of it, his mind drew the picture. He saw eyes. The blonde launched from his bed and turned the light on, heart beating frantically as he watched the silhouette of a man turn into the image of a door. He stared hard at the object with eyes of fear, wondering if it would take on a different shape again. Bakugou stepped back with his eyes trained on the door. He sat on his bed and continued to stare, not bothering to lie down or turn the light back off. All he did was stare at the door. I just need to make sure. Just make sure, and then I'll go to sleep. The boy stared for as long as he could, and when tiredness washed over him, he'd reason with his body with promises of sleep to come. Then he'd stare again for hours on end, just to make sure. He'd go to sleep soon. Just in case. Just in case. A thing in common chapter text. The boy couldn't help but stare at the blonde's empty seat. It was still morning, so it wasn't as if the other was late, but Todoroki kept checking just in case he would materialize into the room. He didn't know whether it was common for Bakugou to come early or if he usually came late. In fact, he barely knew anything about the boy. What Midoriya had revealed 2 days before had definitely proven that. Sshoto had always made a habit out of observing people close to him, or any of his classmates. So the fact that he didn't know anything about the blonde proved one thing. Todoroki had never thought of Bakugou as his friend. Sshoto had known how people had felt towards the boy prior to the discovery of his past, because of what he had said. Even if everyone else didn't verbalize their anger as loud as 𝗂𝗧𝗏 did, many others in the class had felt nothing but disgust towards Bakugou. He remembered how his classmates had reacted after Aizawa had managed to pull the blonde out of the classroom. How 𝗂𝗧𝗏 clenched her fists with a heaving chest. How Ajiro looked like he was about to throw up while Tokoyami clicked his beak. How Jiro seemed just about ready to go outside and punch him, only stopped by Yaoyorozu, who was on the verge of tears. How Bakugou's closest friends had frozen at his words and disconnected themselves from everyone else, despite the fact that Todoroki had gone along with Kirishima and Kaminari's plan to fix things with the blonde. He had found himself agreeing with the words that 𝗂𝗧𝗏 had screamed. Anyone who thinks of themselves as Bakugou's friend is kidding themselves. The way Kirishima had tried to defend the blonde's words seemed to prove that fact to Todoroki. Sshoto had been unsure with how he felt about what Bakugou had said in his argument with 𝗂𝗧𝗏. He didn't know how to describe the feeling other than saying he hadn't been surprised. The blonde had always seemed like that type of person to him, someone insensitive and cruel, whose burning hot quirk resembled that of flames from a hand desperate to hurt and burn, desperate to destroy everything in their wake. He had reminded Todoroki of his father, a bully, an aggressor, an abuser, someone who didn't even deserve the title of hero. And now guilt ate away at him for ever thinking of his classmate like that. Bakugou wasn't an abuser, but someone who had been abused, someone like him, even if it wasn't the same, even if they could never really understand each other. Bakugou had felt pain, and pain was what Todoroki thought the blonde only inflicted. That's why he felt so guilty. He remembered how Kaminari had come rushing to wake everyone up the day before, with tears and jumbled words and snot, talking of how Bakugou had reacted when he saw him, scared and panicked. Remembered how Kirishima jumped up and went out to look for him, followed by many others, only to all come back with defeated slumps. No one had been able to find the blonde. Not until he came back himself with harsh words and insults before stomping up to his room. Even if nobody knew, anyone could see that Bakugou had always tried his hardest, always pushing himself to be the best, probably fighting to overcome what happened to him, maybe even already overcoming it. But it made 𝗏𝗲's stomach twist, that something like that happened to someone so young. Bakugou was strong, definitely stronger than him. Todoroki, who was an abused child trying to become a hero. He had been young too, but he had already known and understood that type of life, something he shouldn't have at such a tender age. But he was already desensitized to it all. Not surprised in any way at the shift from bruises on his mother's body to bruises on his. But to a child, something like that, something like rape, it made Todoroki shiver at the mere thought. He himself had suffered too, but people knew about it and cared for him. He understood that now. He had his siblings. He had Midoriya, a friend who had helped him immensely. He had even made friends with his other classmates and was starting to make more. And he had his mother too, something he never thought he'd be able to say. He thought he'd never get the chance, not since boiling water met tender skin. But despite all the support and the kindness and the love, he would sometimes still find himself choked in fear at the thought of flames and hits that gave way to bruises, to scars. So he couldn't imagine how Bakugou felt. Bakugou, who had no one who knew, and the only one who did, had betrayed him in a way that was unforgivable. 𝗏𝗲 cringed knowing Midoriya had betrayed the blonde once more. He had no right to criticize the boy for his actions, as he had been one of the people who had urged him to talk. Not to mention that he wouldn't be viewing Bakugou like this if it wasn't for it. But the two-tone boy couldn't help how his heart clenched knowing Bakugou had been cheated a second time. That's why he had been staring at the other's vacant seat. He wasn't completely sure what he'd do when the blonde came. Whether he wanted to ask how he was, greet him, or even do anything at all. But he just wanted to make sure the other was coming. Wanted to see if he was all right. He had to make up for all the time he had been negligent to his classmates' suffering. Apparently Todoroki wasn't the only one who thought this, because despite the mutter of chatter drifting through the air, everyone seemed to be quiet, watching and waiting for the blonde to enter. The half-tone boy took time to examine the faces he could see. Kirishima seemed to be on edge, not even bothering to keep a smile on his face or act discreet as he blatantly gazed at the classroom door, jumping in glee at every opening of the entrance only to slump slightly and offer a half-hearted greeting to the visitor he hadn't hoped for. Mina and Zero attempted talking to a sullen Kaminari whose gaze was downcast as he hunched in on himself. They wore strained smiles and spoke with fake joy, hoping to cheer up the uncharacteristically sad blonde, both shooting glances to the door when they thought the other wasn't looking. Midoriya had been scribbling away in a workbook for school, trying to act unaffected by what was happening around him, or perhaps trying to distract himself. He had tensed every time he heard the door open, only to unclench his muscles in relief knowing it hadn't been who he had expected. And Uraraka didn't come to school. That's all Tsuyu had told him when he tilted his head in confusion at not seeing the pair together. He could only nod in understanding, then wondered if he should have stayed back at the dorms as well. After all, I agreed with everything she said, but she had been the one to say it out loud. And it was so much worse for her because of it. The girl had raged to 𝗏𝗏 before about how she was starting to really hate Bakugou. She had revealed how much of a bad person she thought he was, and Todoroki was somewhat surprised at just how much loathing she held towards the boy. And these were all things she had said to Bakugou's face, always shouting insult after insult towards the blonde she despised, practically harassing someone who she now knew had been through something so traumatic. The same traumatic thing she had said he could never begin to understand. So of course she wouldn't come. It made sense, no matter how cowardly it was. 𝗏𝗏 had been too caught up in his thoughts to notice how the surrounding noise had quietened. It had been so abrupt that he looked up in confusion. Then he saw Ash Blonde and understood. A feeling of relief washed through him at the sight. He almost wanted to laugh at how much his attitude towards Bakugou was changing, feeling bitter about how two-faced he was being. But he couldn't help it. Even if he had been close-minded in the past, he had been given the opportunity to make up for it now. The blonde glared at all eyes that turned to look at him, and Todoroki couldn't help but notice how his hands still held onto the door, as if they were his only link to escape and he was going to run out any second. 𝗏𝗏 also noticed how jittery Bakugou seemed, his free hand clenching and unclenching, faint mounds of dark skin residing underneath his eyes. Those same eyes scattering wildly around the room, and a thin jumper under his uniform that covered his neck. Todoroki's eyes widened. Oh, Kirishima jumped up immediately and let out an enthusiastic greeting that left the two-toned boy unable to organize his thoughts. Hey, Bakugou, good morning. Bakugou seemed to relax at this as he scoffed slightly and let go of the door, grunting out what was probably his idea of a response as he headed for his seat. 𝗏𝗏 didn't miss the way Kaminari had perked up and attempted to catch the blonde's eye, but Bakugou had flat out ignored him, causing the boy to return to a sorrowful stupor. The room still held an air of tension. It was different from the previous anger it had before, but this was just as suffocating. Either it was due to guilt, that everyone in the room now knew something about the blonde that he would never want them to, something that he's unaware that they even know, or frustration that no one could do anything about it even though they knew. Perhaps it was both. But what was bothering Todoroki at the moment was the thin piece of material coiling Bakugou's neck, the same neck that Midoriya had recalled the blonde scratching at, as a way to hurt himself. He must have been the only one to notice it because no one else seemed to focus on the covered skin. But Midoriya did. The boy's green eyes were wide and his jaw was open, seemingly in a daze. He probably didn't even notice how hard he was staring. Mind likely filled with memories of pulling sparking hands away from abused skin that dripped in blood. 𝗏𝗲 was sure the freckled boy would get called out for his staring and wanted to warn him. He was pondering over how to catch the green-haired boy's attention. But almost immediately after, their homeroom teacher entered the room. Thankfully, this caused Midoriya to snap out of it, and his hesitant eyes shifted to the disheveled man. Tired eyes swept over the classroom, stopping short on Bakugou before a lazy voice muttered out, "Aren't you supposed to be cleaning up?" The blonde only grunted. "Already finished that shit." Aizawa simply nodded. "Then that should be it." To which Bakugou seemed relieved. It was a rather confusing exchange, and Todoroki couldn't help but wonder what they were talking about. But then he remembered that Bakugou had been punished for his outburst in class. He recalled seeing the boy in detention, cleaning the common room or throwing out trash, all while loudly muttering profanities and curses under his breath. The 𝗧𝗵𝗲 boy thought he deserved it but also thought it was a waste of time. He didn't believe there was anything that would make the blonde reflect on his actions or his words. 𝗏𝗏 found it peculiar that Bakugou had only been punished for wrecking the classroom and not for what he said. After all, this was a hero school, so it would only be fitting that looking down on victims wouldn't be tolerated. Maybe it would be better if the blonde did get punished for his words. That kind of thinking was highly toxic, so the school should have already dealt with it, and maybe along the way, the heroes would find what the boy had really meant when he said it, and help him. Actually, that would definitely be better. Because if Bakugou's words were anything to go by, it was obvious that he had a very broken outlook on life and possibly even himself. But that's what really stumped 𝗏𝗏. Had the words Bakugou had said really been meant for himself? The blonde had always presented himself as overconfident and arrogant, always seeming to place himself above others and never acknowledging the people around him. So full of himself that it was irritating. Could all of that have really been a lie? An act to hide how broken he was? Todoroki mulled over the thought for the entire lesson, not focusing on his work and giving half-assed answers to the questions he was asked. Before the boy knew it, a few lessons had passed by and it was already lunch. Some students had filtered out of the room to entertain themselves with other things and some had stayed, all using the time to relax. But this felt impossible for 𝗏𝗏, as his mind was on overdrive. Did he really hurt himself? That question was most important. After all, it was possible that Bakugou had just felt like dressing warm and Todoroki was overreacting. But on the off chance that he did, he had to make sure. The dual quirk user stood abruptly and made his way over to where Bakugou sat. The boy could see that Kirishima had already been talking to the blonde, but the redhead had made sure to maintain a careful distance between them, and spoke with words that seemed scripted, sometimes glancing over at his friends busy comforting a sullen blonde. It was obvious to Todoroki that both Mina and 𝗏𝗏 could have joined the conversation and talked with Bakugou, but that would have left out Kaminari, who the blonde had decided to ignore ever since the night he punched him. 𝗏𝗏 cut into the conversation. "May I speak to you, Bakugou?" The blonde raised a brow in questioning while Kirishima regarded Todoroki with a welcoming smile. "No, fuck off," the boy answered. Todoroki blinked, completely unfazed by the blunt rejection. "It won't take too much of your time, but it is rather urgent." Bakugou narrowed his eyes in annoyance. "Did you not hear me the first time, or did all that ice freeze your fucking brain?" "I said no, bastard." Todoroki only shook his head. "The use of my quirk does not affect the functions of my brain. Neither does it my ears. I heard you perfectly fine." The blonde sneered. "Then why the fuck are you still here?" "Because I'm not listening to you," 𝗏𝗏 droned. Kirishima waved his hands widely. "Whoa, dude, I get you want to talk, but Bakugou says he doesn't, so maybe you should just leave it." Bakugou barked. "I have a fucking mouth, shit for brains. Don't speak for me." 𝗏𝗏 watched the redhead apologize profusely as the blonde continued to scold him. He didn't want to waste time. The two-tone boy had already set out to do something, and wasn't going to be deterred from it. "So, can we talk?" The two stopped their bickering, and stared at the scarred boy, one with a gaze of anger and the other with that of bafflement. Todoroki didn't notice that a boy with green hair had walked up to him until he felt a hesitant tug on his arm. "See, Todoroki, maybe you should leave Kaken alone for now." Midoriya stuttered nervously. Green eyes looked up at him with a wide and pleading gaze. 𝗏𝗏 pondered over just dropping the whole thing and not bothering his classmates further, but knowing how serious his worries of Bakugou's possible self-harming were, he knew it would be wrong to just leave things unsaid. Before 𝗧𝗪 could relay these thoughts to Midoriya, an angry voice called out, "Fuck off, nerd. None of this shit involves you and yet you're still in my fucking face. Just piss off, you annoying shit." Bakugou's harsh words made Midoriya shrink in on himself. Todoroki was unsure what to do in that moment. He had always defended Midoriya in the past against Bakugou's incessant bullying, but now that he understood the reason the blonde held so much resentment towards his freckled friend, he couldn't help but feel more understanding towards the constant insults he directed. He hadn't said anything yesterday when Bakugou was mean to the green-eyed boy, dumbly undefending of his friend, but that didn't mean it hadn't bothered him greatly. Midoriya was his friend, a very important one, and it wouldn't feel right if Todoroki allowed him to be insulted just because he sympathized with his bully. 𝗧𝗪 was about to say something but was surprised to hear that it was Kirishima that decided to comment on the blonde's words. "Dude, don't be so harsh towards Midoriya." The redhead frowned. There hadn't been many times where Todoroki found himself shocked. Finding out about Bakugou had been something that he thought was a one-off. But this was another event that had him stumped. Obviously not as much as the first, but the fact that it surprised him even a little said a lot. It's not like Kirishima had never scolded Bakugou for his words or actions. In fact, he seemed to be one of the only people brave enough to do it constantly. But the redhead had always strayed away from one topic, and that topic was Midoriya. Anyone could see that there was some sort of history between both Bakugou and Midoriya, but no one knew what it was, so most didn't try to pry or get involved. This included Kirishima. Though the boy did stop Bakugou from harassing the nervous boy, he had never directly shown that his actions were to defend the other, likely avoiding offending his friend over what was obviously a very personal subject. But he had just done that now, and Todoroki couldn't help but wonder what the boy was thinking. Did he think that just because he knew about their past, he could mention it now? 𝗧𝗪 could only mark down the redhead's actions as stupid. In fact, they were downright ignorant and idiotic. It was the only description he could think of looking at Bakugou's reaction. The blonde, who had been previously seething at Midoriya, blinked and turned to look at Kirishima with disbelief. "What did you say?" Bakugou muttered, words almost a whisper. Kirishima shuffled awkwardly, uncomfortable at the sudden shift of atmosphere. I just mean that you should probably calm down, dude." The blonde was silent for a while before muttering again. "No, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking what you said." Kirishima rubbed the back of his neck and stayed silent. Todoroki could tell that this was going south. "You just said I should leave Deku alone." Bakugou growled as if the redhead had done something unforgivable. "You think I'm fucking bullying him or some shit? That's why you're taking his side." Kirishima looked dumbfounded at how insecure and defensive Bakugou sounded. The redhead shook his head frantically and put his hands up in surrender. "No, dude, I'm just," the blonde raged. "Why the fuck are defending Deku?" He spat and the green-haired boy continued to shrink where he stood. It's not that big of a deal. I was just helping him out a bit. Don't be mad, bro." Kirishima tried reasoning, but Bakugou continued to sneer. "He has other dipshits in the class to help him. You don't need to. You're supposed to be." Bakugou stopped himself from finishing his sentence, probably realizing that he sounded too emotional. Kirishima's eyes widened hearing the cracks in his friend's voice and looked as if he wanted to say something more, but the blonde spun so he was no longer facing the redhead, but rather facing Todoroki. "You said you wanted to talk. Lead the fucking way." 𝗧𝗪 blinked in slight surprise but nodded, shooting a glance towards Kirishima, who had a hurt expression as he stared at Bakugou, who was ignoring him. He led the blonde out of the classroom and had to calm himself when the boy barged past Midoriya. Todoroki could guess what Bakugou had been planning to say before he cut himself off, and from the look on Kirishima's face, the redhead knew too. "You're supposed to be my friend." When they got a distance away from the classroom to a more secluded area, 𝗧𝗪 realized that the blonde was no longer following him. He turned to see Bakugou eyeing him with skepticism. "Why the fuck do we need to talk here? You planning on murdering me or something?" The blonde grunted. 𝗧𝗪 could see that. Although he was trying to uphold an air of confidence, Bakugou was glaring at him in over-awareness, eyes following every move he made and posture uncomfortably ready for a fight. Paranoia, Todoroki thought simply. The dual quirk user walked up to Bakugou, making sure to keep a reasonable distance between them before he spoke. "We don't need to go any further than this. I suppose here is fine." Bakugou grumbled. "Well, start fucking talking, 𝗧𝗍. I haven't got all day." Unfazed by the boy's prickly attitude, 𝗧𝗪 tried to approach in a way that was careful and sensitive. "Show me your neck." The blonde froze and looked at him with wide crimson eyes. Todoroki cringed at his words and chastised himself for not preparing better. But he had only been focused on talking to Bakugou, not how he would. The ash blonde stepped back with shaking hands, so obviously panicked, yet trying to hide. "What kind of shitty request is that?" 𝗧𝗪 tried to choose his next words carefully. "I would just like to check something. To put my mind at ease." Bakugou glared at the other. "Yeah, well, I don't really give a fuck about putting your mind at ease," he spoke mockingly. The blonde didn't give the other time to respond as he was already turning and walking away, muttering how this was a waste of his fucking time. Todoroki realized he had to act quick. His worry for what could have been hiding under the boy's collar had spurred him to stop the other from walking away. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 grabbed Bakugou's wrist. Just wait a second. The two-toned boy's words were cut off when an explosion went off, targeting directly at his face. He was caught off guard but managed to push the other away and step back to gain some distance, resulting in the ends of his hair getting singed. Bakugou looked somewhat surprised at how he set off his quirk, attacking someone in a way that would have definitely been lethal if the blow made contact. But he quickly regained his composure. Stop being so goddamn persistent. The blonde's voice strained slightly, not intimidating but more desperate than anything else. Todoroki stepped back somewhat, realizing his mistake in not keeping personal space. I apologize. It wasn't right for me to do that. I understand if you don't want to talk, but could you grant the request? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 stopped short when he saw Bakugou's harsh glare. Like I said, stub, I'm only concerned for your well-being, the two-tone boy stated, trying not to respond to the other's aggressive approach. Since when did you start fucking caring? The blonde said simply, not a question but a statement. You've never butted into my business before, so fuck off. I ain't trusting any friend of Deku's. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 stared at the blonde, his patience growing thin. He had no right to be angry. After all, it was true. He had never been interested in Bakugou before learning about what happened, and all he was doing now was satisfying some arrogant savior complex that told him the blonde needed help. But despite all this, 𝗧𝗵𝗲's annoyance grew. Bakugou always managed to irritate him in a way that no one else could. The boy considered himself emotionally restrained, but all of that was thrown out the window when faced with the frustrating blonde. You say that, and yet all the people you hang out with are Midoriya's friends. The blonde narrowed his eyes at Todoroki's words. Kirishima is your friend, and yet he still defended Midoriya. It's not one side against the other. The only one with a problem is you. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 watched the blonde twitch at the mention of the redhead's actions and realized he should probably stop there. You don't know shit. If you think Deku's actually your friend, then you're dumber than I thought. Todoroki shook his head. He is my friend and he wants to be yours too. Whatever happened between you in the past? Bakugou's hands sparked. Shit didn't happen. Nothing did. I don't need a reason to hate Deku. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 let out a sigh, trying not to let the conversation derail any more than it already had. Whether you have a reason or not, that's not what I came here for. Just show me, please. The blonde grew agitated as his explosions grew in size. Fuck off. Fuck off. Todoroki tried to seem as unthreatening as possible. Bakugou. Just this time the boy was forced to put up a wall of ice to block the large explosion that was sent his way. The dual quirk user tensed, waiting for more attacks, but nothing came. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 cursed and ran around the frozen structure he created to look at the other side. Bakugou was gone. He let out a sigh and stared at the glacier of ice he had created. I went too far. It wasn't necessary. He overstepped his boundaries. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 needed to remind himself that he's not Bakugou's friend. The blonde wouldn't spill his guts to him just because he asked. What he did was wrong. Todoroki had just hid his true intentions under a ruse of concern, when in reality he had his own selfish reasons. As much as he loved his siblings and as much as Midoriya had helped him, they could never understand. And his mother, he would never dare bring up the subject with her. So yes, it was possible that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had only called the blonde out of his own interests. True, he was worried, but it would be a lie to say that that was all. The two-toned boy couldn't help but laugh bitterly. He had just been looking for someone. Help, help, hurts, it hurts, please, someone who. Mum, come back, don't leave, understood? I'm sorry, don't leave me alone. The pain, not with him, please. Todoroki lifted a hand to rest over his scar. That would be nice. The boy rested his hot palm on the cool solid structure. It hissed and gurgled in protest against the heat, white gas emitting from it. He was forced to look away as licks of violent flame destroyed the precious ice.